Merry Christmas. Hey, Luber. Hey, Dimitri. How you doing? How you doing, Luber?
What, what's up? What's up? I'm doing well. I'm happy that I was able to make it today.
Aw, we're happy you were able to make it.
I was
So,
having, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
no, I was just gonna say, are we seeing? Oh, by the way, Dimitri wrote a tremendous Substack on Spinoza that is worth years of study. Very profound. I really
I'll
appreciate
have to check
Dimitri.
it
I
out.
really hope does an effing book where he takes his work on like Descartes and Dimitri. We're gonna pressure you to do a book, Dimitri. I think it'll be magnificent. And Tyler, good to see you. And Mr. Parsons, good to see you. Oh, Leibniz next. Oh snap! Oh snap! So do you think like Santa should have told everyone he was going to use drones this year? Because it's really messed everyone up. That's really thrown everyone off. I'll throw it to Mr. Luber. It's actually a really interesting case study. Like, what is the responsible way to think about like something like that? I find interesting. It's hilarious. Mr. Luber, please.
I wanted to talk about something that I was actually talking about with my mom this morning, because I was talking about idle talk, um, and that it's funny that because what it was, she overthink everything, and that I was saying that I'm just thinking, like this is just what it is. And she was saying how it's kind of like pointless in a certain sense to have this like philosophical way of thinking. And I thought, well, you kind of talk very idle talk in a way, and that's there's a lack of substance. And I find it ironic that the person that's on the philosophical side more so finds the idle talk to be a lacking of substance, but the person in the idle talk side more is finds themselves thinking about the philosophical stupid and pointless and doesn't actually pay what's here now. And, and that was an interesting dichotomy where it's how do you find the nice middle where you understand that okay in real time sometimes the idle talk actually is what gets people moving, so to speak, in the moment in everyday life, and it feels like it pertains more to their everyday life. Like for example, in my opinion, gossip is a form of idle talk, and it's like you're gossiping and it seems like it's very salient and important to your life world in that conversation in real time, but from the philosophical perspective it's like, well, that's that there's no substance there, you're not actually having a real conversation. But you say that to the person with the idle talk, they're just like, you talking about philosophy like this, I don't care, it's not affecting my life like the gossip is. So it's just funny how that works, and I kind of just wanted to throw that out there today on the net because I think it's part of the problem of like even like the beauty book. It's like, do we talk too philosophical or do we go more for the layman's man? It's the same problem I had with my theme book where it's like, how deep and dense do I want to go? Who's it going to reach? What, like, it's finding that line of communicating such that you have the philosophical in mind in the communication and you're able to have almost the idle side in mind, and balancing that out, and it just seems extremely difficult if not impossible. But yeah, I'll pass it off.
No, I think that's a tremendous conversation. Javier, good to see you, sir. Mr. Parsons. I had mentioned that Santa should have let people know that he was going to use drones this year because it's caused a whole lot of confusion. But that's actually a funny case study as well because, like, when is talking about drones just a waste of time? Or when is it really a national security issue? When is the national security issues being used to manipulate people versus real issues? I think first off, there is no such thing. Like, what is the word idle talk? And then I'll give it to Dimitri and Javier here. And Tyler, if you want to speak, please. I saw you unmuted, but no pressure at all. And you're a beautiful
Oh,
man. You are
oh man.
such. No, I like listening to your breathing. Ah, there it is. Ah, yeah. Oh, that's artistic breathing there. But I'll give it to Dimitri and Javier. Like, what's very important is the word idle talk is funny because it's like talk that doesn't go anywhere, right? Like idle. Or does it mean idol like idolatrous? Like you are worshiping something that's not a highest thing, right? Because what is idolatry? Idolatry is where you worship or direct your attention towards something unworthy of it, or that you're giving substance with your attention that you shouldn't be, right? So there's a way in which there's an interesting wordplay where idle talk is you're wasting time to speak about it, but it also is kind of aligned with not only are you maybe wasting time to speak about it, you may be reifying something you ought not to reify. You could make it something very problematic, right? There's also an idea that idle talk, like to your point there, Mr. Luber, is talk when you shouldn't have it. You should be silent instead, right? It is interesting to think, is there such thing as idle silence? Like, is there a silence that's idle, right? We tend to talk about idle talk, but isn't there such a possibility of silence that's kind of idolatrous because you're not talking when you should be, you're not creating a relationship? So what's the opposite of idle talk is interesting. I think basically, and Clayton, good to see you, sir. Basically, there is no such thing as talk that cannot be problematic, right? There can be business talk that's problematic. There can be political talk that's problematic. There can be media talk that's problematic. There can be philosophical talk that's problematic. There can be small talk that's problematic. The question becomes the following: what makes talk problematic? And how do you identify talk worth having? Like, what is talk worth having? Because there's plenty of small talk that is worth having, right? Because it, warms people up, makes them willing to talk with one another. There's lots of talk about, say, family history that's worth having, because otherwise you don't know your roots. And all of us know philosophical talk that's not worth having because it's simply professionals or people trying to show off or something, right? So how do you identify talk worth having? Is a very interesting question. And and also there's a question of why is idle talk bad? Like, why is it bad, right? What were we doing that makes it so bad, right? Why is it like, maybe we're just all wasting our time. Well, why is it bad to waste time? Relative to what? We could be like making money? Like, why is it a waste to be idle, right? Is there a certain sort of assumption that being not idle is better than being idle, right? There's something odd about that. There seems to be also an assumption that silence would be better in a time of idle talk, or talk that is substantive. Well, then, of course, the question is the following: what is substantive talk versus idle talk, right? What would be, if I say productive talk, well, that could be economic, right? Beautiful talk, maybe beautiful talk is the opposite of idle talk, right? Maybe divine speech is the opposite of idle talk with IDOL. So it's interesting because then it seems as if every talk can be a vanity of vanities, Ecclesiastes versions of it. There is no topic that is immune from being idle. But then, if that's the case, how do we identify when it's not idle? What are we looking for? Is it engagement? Is it a feeling of relationship? This is idle because I don't feel connected. Is that what people are responding to? There are interesting questions there, but let me give it to the great Dimitri here, whose Substack is always an event. Very well done on the Spinoza. I hope you publish a book on like the entire thrust of philosophy in that realm. Dimitri, please.
Yeah, let's. I'm gonna take the risk that Luber is kind of worrying about and extremely dive into the deep end here, because I've been sitting with this intensely frustrating question that, okay, so why am I even like reading Descartes and then Spinoza, and now I'm gonna go into Leibniz? Because I want to read Kant. But why do I want to read Kant? Because I actually want to read the science of logic again. That's all I want to do. That's all I want to do. I want to read the science of logic, but I need to read everything. So with Spinoza too, but also with Leibniz, I'm at a crossroads because Spinoza mentions Hobbes, who is of course an Englishman, or at least British, but then Leibniz was actually influenced to a certain extent, which I don't know yet, by Locke. So if you will open up Hegel's History of Philosophy, you'll see that when you get to the chapter of modern philosophy, there's immediately a split between continental and Anglo that first manifests as Francis Bacon versus Jacob Böhme. Now, Leibniz versus Newton is another variant of it. Also, like rationalists versus empiricists at large, so Descartes and Spinoza versus someone like Locke and a Berkeley and a Hume. But so what's frustrating me right now is that, and Daniel, I know you've read Hume very deeply, and with if you've read like Bacon and like Locke and stuff, I would also be curious because I'm like, fuck, should I first read Locke and Hume before I can even start Leibniz? or or not, you know? I mean, honestly, I think that I mean, it's always a problem. Someone asked me today this question. Oh, I want to start reading philosophy. What do you recommend? It's like the worst question you can get, right? I always think Freud is a good way to go because it's very personal and stuff like this. Um, and but yeah, then again, I think for myself, having read quite a bit now, I think Descartes is a nice starting point because he really does kickstart modern philosophy with this idea that I think, therefore I am, which is like, on the one hand, purely insubstantial. Like, of course, that's the case. It's self-evident. Why would you even have to say such a thing? But then also, there's something that's absolutely certain in that in the doubting subject that's taken for that Descartes takes to be of importance. So I think that's a major turn that we get with modern philosophy, that Kant radicalizes and eventually many others radicalize post Kant. So yeah, but then for me, like the whole empiricist school, the whole like English school is actually kind of a black hole for me, and I know it's very important. Take like the whole Anglo versus more continental discussion now. It's like Nick Land versus Zizek. That's how I would put it, right? So it's not Newton versus Leibniz, but it's Land versus Zizek. So yeah, Daniel, please, or anyone, if you have any thoughts about this, please let me know because I'm very interested in like how did we even end up in this place, right? That it's like British versus continental. It's very, very curious to me.
Oh, I think that's just a big old question. And Philip and Michael and everyone, it's good to see you. I think that's a fascinating question. On the kind of differences between these schools, there's plenty of people that suggest these schools like don't really exist, that they're just arbitrary designations. And on what basis do you make these designations? And as you know, I kind of think that there's this entire movement that I call the modern counter-enlightenment that has completely been missed, that's not even recorded. So if all these kind of schools do is bracket out other schools that don't even get to be part of the conversation, what is the value of these differences? And then, of course, there are people that turn around and say counter-enlightenment isn't even a valid category because the Enlightenment itself consisted of counter-enlightenment thought. So what does that distinction even mean? Isaiah Berlin just make things hard on everyone, right? I think in some respects, if I were to take a general stab at, I think different schools must be different approaches to resolve metaphysical paradoxes, ultimately. And a way to look at Bacon in the English direction is where when you're dealing with a metaphysical dilemma, or let's just say an impasse, what direction do you go in? And that becomes kind of a very big question. So you could look at Bacon, like Bacon's big, and I think a lot of the English people, unless you get to like the English emergentism in like the 19th century, a lot of these people are like, hey, when we have a dispute on what is truth, the best approach is actually to gather a heck of a lot of minute details, like minute information, and see if we can resolve them. And, if you gather enough data, then ultimately in empiricism and things like that, then ultimately you're going to be able to resolve an impasse, right? Where someone like, they would say like an Aristotle, when you get a metaphysical quandary, what you do is then move into metaphysical speculation, and that's how you move beyond it, right? And so there's this idea that actually gathering up a lot of really small details, like the temperature of the frozen turkey, or what price is it outside, et cetera, so forth, is actually how you resolve it. But this is actually very interesting, because it might actually tie, we were talking, and Mr. Jockin, good to see you, and I'll give it to Javier, on the difference between idle talk and philosophical talk. When Francis Bacon and a lot of the hard empiricists went in the direction of, well, maybe we should just gather a whole lot of like minute facts and details. Everyone's like, that's idle talk in a sense. That's a waste of time. Why in the world would you think you could solve the mysteries of the universe by gathering countless data points, by being a kind of thankless person in the laboratory to categorize and study all these different rocks? That seems to be idle talk, idle thought. That's not going to get us anywhere. If you want to resolve giant questions about the universe, you need to think of the whole, the giant like metaphysical system, if you will. But so there's this idea that no, a way to go about it is to deal with measurements, like to really kind of agree on tools of measurement, that everything can kind of follow and to gather data up. And ultimately, if we just really kind of gather up empirical data, we're going to go from there. Now, I think basically the split then begins to happen. It's like, well, you do know there's no such thing as a meter in nature, right? Like, you do know there's no such thing as a yardstick in nature, right? The very tools by which you're making objective measurements are already subjectively framed. And I think what ultimately happens, without going too much into it, because I think it's a fascinating question, is that some people think that that's a big deal. Like, it really is extremely philosophically consequential if the measuring stick itself is subjectively mediated. And other people say, okay, that's a good point, but it's really practically irrelevant. It's not going to ultimately change the conclusion, even if it's a fine, yeah, sure, everything like foot, meter, inch, fact, all of these are always already situated in something, but that doesn't really make any consequential difference, they don't think, right? So at that point, I think you get a kind of emphasis debate on how deep is the rabbit hole once you start to say that the very tools by which you measure data in the world are themselves subjectively mediated. How much does that consequently and causally matter? Does it matter, or is all of that just some kind of idle talk per se? Or is there some sort of truth that can only be accessed when you really look into the abyssal depths of what that would mean? I think those things open up. The other direction here is the status of philosophy itself. And I think you can see the Anglo and the Continental both. I think I bounce them off the Scottish Enlightenment, as you know, with Hume, because in the Scottish Enlightenment, and I'll get to Javier and to Mr. Luber, basically they see, David Hume thinks the biggest problem of philosophy is philosophy itself. Philosophy, the ability to speculate, is itself the problem. Because if we can speculate, we can deconstruct ourselves into oblivion, just like radical, like the role of doubt, right? Like for David Hume, doubt is precisely why we're in danger, because I can obliterate myself into oblivion. He calls it melancholia. We today would call it the meaning crisis. He calls it philosophical melancholia. So he's like, hey, philosophy makes possible melancholia, and also it makes power totalitarianism, because people can ground political legitimacy in giant metaphysical principles, and yet we must philosophize. We must, because otherwise we can be manipulated, otherwise we can't understand ourselves. But the moment we can philosophize, we're in danger. And there is a way, in this case would have to be made, you can almost see English, Continental, and those are different responses to that danger. Okay, yes, we can speculate. Yes, we can think. How do we deal with that danger? Well, the English are like, well, by making it servant to a bunch of minute details and give them the final authority. And we really look at that. Another one would say, well, by making it function and serve the subject and binding it to the subject versus some sort of larger project, right? Or other people say, well, we find the system in which to contain the thought so that it doesn't turn back on us and deconstruct us into oblivion, right? So you could say that there are you could also say that these different schools, and I'm not saying this overlays perfectly, but you could say that these different schools are actually different responses to the problem of thinking itself. And that thinking can actually destroy us. And also, thinking is necessary but can self-deceive us. So the problem of philosophy as a problem itself, which is arguably the problem of doubt, how do you resolve that? How do you best address that? And maybe you can best address it by simply making the empirical method primary, right? But then someone like Hegel comes along and he's like, no, you really can't do that. And then to your question of where do you start in philosophy? Well, this may, again, tie to this question of idle talk, because I think people start philosophy somewhere where the idle talk broke. Like they were having conversations and something broke, a relationship failed, the conversation wasn't able to address something. And I would say that you should start philosophy in the area that you feel like most resonates with that point that idle talk failed, or talk turned out to be idle, or talk failed, or something failed in conversation. I really do think most people, a lot of people, especially who are not academic, go into philosophy because of relational issues, like communal, family, relational issues. And that's funny because to Andrew's original question, what's the difference between, it's funny because people view philosophy as idle talk, right? They see that as not going anywhere, right? A lot of the people, though, that went to philosophy are almost like because of a double revelation of realizing talk could be idle, talk could be hiding something, talk could be empty and problematic. So then they went over to this philosophy talk that maybe they themselves would have thought was a waste of time before they did it, but they went over there to get a way to escape talk that reifies something idolatrous, right? And so there's also like what broke in your life? And that becomes the entry point, I think, for philosophy. Because, I mean, and Mr. Kashir, good to see you. Because I think, and I'll give it to Javier, Andrew, Michael, and then Michelle. I think ultimately, if you ask the question, what's the proper starting point of thought? It's almost like a difference in Derrida, right? It just kind of keeps going and keep going. But if you ask the point, where was I broken? And where do the words of the philosopher resonate with that wound? That can be a starting point. And then travel the path based on who reads who in that point, what way seems to elucidate. And also, I think the idea of having read the science of logic, but wanting to return a true infinity to know it for the first time, is that becomes a binding principle as well to your journey, right? One has to find binding principles. All of these schools of thought are kind of dealing with the binding problem of thought. Thought can be infinite, therefore thought can destroy you. So how best do we bind it without at the same time losing thought of the human subject? You need a binding principle. And I think often a lot of people, their binding principle can in fact be their very wound. Like, does it speak to the wound and does it heal it? Or it could be something like returning to the science of logic to read it through new eyes for the very first time. Those are some initial thoughts. I'm always interested in the question of schools and as different sort of ways to address these metaphysical rational impasses that we find. But let me give it to Mr. Rivera, Luber, Michael, and then Michelle. Mr. Rivera, please.
Be here, guys. Yeah.
It's Christmas. All right. Let me ask you something. I just say during December, I say Merry Christmas to people in general, but more and more people are saying it's not Christmas yet, and it confuses me. Because I just thought December was you say Merry Christmas to people, but more and more people are saying it's not Christmas yet. It just confuses me. I don't know.
I mean, I don't know, Daniel. I mean, you're supposed to say like Happy Holidays or something.
I'm a monster. I'm a monster. That's all there is to it. That's right. I'll just get under my desk. It's great to see you guys. It's really cold. It's so cold. It's really cold down there.
What a yeah, I mean, I guess that's all idle talk. Yeah, so it's really interesting because Dimitri's coming from like a complete opposite side of where I'm coming from, or at least I feel like where I'm coming from, because I've been spending a lot of time with like the saints and like the mystics, and I'm reading Thomas Aquinas with Jockin, and it's really interesting because Jockin and I are kind of laughing at Thomas Aquinas because we realize like he's really autistic. Like he's like super autistic, like it's insane. Like you read the Summa and like there's like this weird paranoia where he's like, I feel like they're gonna misunderstand me, so I'm gonna put that as my objection, and then I'm gonna give you my correct answer. So every objection that you initially read, you like already can tell what the answer is. It's like the good guy's gonna win in the end kind of thing. Like what the answer is gonna be. It's going to be not the objection, right? It's going to be opposite to the objection, right? But anyways, I had a wonderful conversation with Jockin yesterday, and this I think aligns with this idea of idle talk, which is so I guess if our metaphysics change, then truth as an object becomes something different. Like it seems like when people dismiss something like Luber's point, is that everything has kind of flattened out. And Aquinas makes this good point about if you're gonna go for the truth, if you're gonna go for the truth, Aquinas says that you should go for the science that has the most certainty. But if there's a higher object, then you go for that object, even if it doesn't have the highest certainty. So that means that God, as the higher object, would be the one we're striving for. So I guess when we're talking about idle talk, it would be, what is the object of truth that it circulates around? Because if there is no higher object of truth, then in some sense, yes, like someone's rebuttal to Luber would be perfectly correct. You have idle talk too, essentially, because all of our objects are the same. So how can we determine, and this kind of goes back to your measure question, Daniel, like how can we have this measure? And it's really funny because, Aquinas looks at God as the mean, right? God is the mean to from which all measure comes, because goodness is convertible with being, so God is the sovereign good, so God would be the measure. And I'm just thinking, like, yeah, it's really hard after like Aristotle, Aquinas kind of metaphysics. I feel like it's really hard to have a kind of object of truth per se, because now we run into the realm of like more phenomenological points, which like, oh, the truth is like unfolding, right? So if the truth unfolds, um, I guess where is the end? What is the end that we're aiming towards? Does phenomenology point to an end? And I guess that would be maybe the argument of contention. Because I feel like idleness, even like when mystics or whatever talk about it, it's kind of like idleness is everything that's not about God, essentially, right? Like if you're not in the spirit of God, you don't have the presence of God in you while you're doing your work and everything, you're kind of like in idleness. So it's really interesting that uh, on this notion of competing objects of truth or competing objects of value, it would seem that is where the idleness lies, right? And I guess that's the debate, it would seem. But I'll leave it there.
No, I think that's magnificent. And Chris, it is so good to see you. It's really good to see you. I hope you're doing well. And it is interesting because, like, the assumption is like the opposite of idle talk is like, I guess, deep talk, right? But what's deep talk? Because there seems to be different depths to it. Maybe what it is that people want mystic talk, right? They want to talk about mystics or kind of the mystical. I think also people basically are looking for something like love talk. They feel connection. And often I think philosophy can be accused of idle, empty talk because people don't feel connected to it, because you kind of have to do it to feel connected to it, right? Whereas what's interesting is very often the talk of kind of like idle talk, like calling something small talk tends to be something that people who do, say, maybe philosophy call other talk, but people who do small talk don't necessarily call it small talk so much, right? Right? There's also something, do we talk about football or different things? There's something about what's being groped at, I think, is a lack of connection. Like there's a lack of connection that isn't quite there that people are trying to feel out. And they don't feel like I'm moving towards you, maybe. It's idle because I'm not moving towards you, or something like that. And so that becomes an issue. And I think there is this kind of idea of moving towards something to connect, mystic talk, love talk. And I think also, there's a part where people are looking for in talk something that's surprising or feeling like enlivened by. They're looking for, oh, something could come out of this that is unexpected, right? And maybe when people talk to philosophy being idle talk, what they mean by that is there's a lack of connection. Like, I don't feel like emotion or connection can come out of this, right? And I think maybe what people are looking for is the feeling that a conversation or a connection or a relationship is a flower bed, that something can grow out of it, that something can move out of it. And one of the reasons I think people move into philosophical talk from it is because they feel like there's something dying or is suffocating in talk without that analysis. And so there's a lack of growth. And when things do surprise, it tends to be anger or conflict or emotional trouble, right? Like there might be an issue here where one's relationship to talk and how they categorize is tied to the quality of the kind of surprise they think is possible in it. the quality of the kind of surprise they think is possible in it, right? Like a lot of people actually are like upset about like small talk. Dimitri, you're beautiful. It's good to see you, sir. And Ethan Nelson, it's good to see you, sir. There's this idea that in a lot of small talk, suddenly there could be conflict, or people are around the table and they're talking and somebody asks, you know, what are you doing at work? And you sense in it, oh, this is surveillance talk. Because there's also a lot of times where people actually conflate small talk. They don't like it because it's actually surveillance talk. You're actually kind of being checked on to make sure you're being practical. You're being checked on to make sure there's something okay. So the reason people dislike that is because the quality of surprise in that kind of conversation is the surprise of surveillance, right? Oh crap, I'm being surveilled, right? That's why I don't like this. It's because suddenly, like, what is the thing that can suddenly appear in the conversation, I think is what a lot of times people are categorizing. It's not really, because you're making a really good point, and I'll give it to Luber, like, well, what do we even think truth is? What is this thing we're orbiting by which we can even talk about the difference between small talk and philosophy talk, right? Like, do people really consciously know what the truth is by which they could say if the talk aligns with it or not? Well, obviously not. But there's a sense of it, right? Well, what exactly is the sense of it? I think it is the kind of surprise they think is possible. Like the sense of is the kind of surprise that is possible in this talk is bad. Therefore, I don't like it. The kind of surprise that's possible in this talk is good. Therefore, I like it. So I think there's something about kind of the question of the quality of surprise that can occur that might be tied to it. So the quality of the surprise, I think, is also part of it. I think people really do, when they come to dislike small talk, it's not so much that you're talking about the weather. It's that they have experiences where talking about the weather were just ways to get into judgments about how you're living your life. And so they don't want to talk about the weather because they just see it as people gradually moving to the place where they then point out that you're not making enough money or you're wasting your potential. So it's actually a surveillance talk more than small talk. So there's the quality of the sense of the quality of the possible surprise afforded by the conversation might be part of it. But let me give it to Mr. Luber. Mr. Luber.
Per usual, you say something profound. I love the surprise element that you're throwing into it. I think that's like an excellent gauge, honestly, that surpasses all binary dichotomies of how one can understand conversation. Because, I mean, just the setup that I gave in the beginning is fallacious in the sense that there is this like binary way of looking at it that flattens everything out just by virtue of the structure of the problem that I'm presenting. And I think it's a good way to always start a conversation that way, to be honest. Being in a short circuit, presenting a short circuit well. I am turning around here. Sorry, I'm dog walking. So I think there's a lot that I want to say. At first, the question of like the object that's being orbiting, the orbiting object that, or whatever that Javier is talking about. This is a little bit with my problem with Lacan, and I think this is just. I think Lacan, and I'm definitely no expert of Lacan, but I like him a lot. It's the problem of subjective destitution. It overlooks the context that it's dependent on, in a certain sense. The thought overlooks the context it depends on. So, like, to view a conversation in terms of the truth object, to me is a way of like of subjective destitution. It's your own first person way of looking at a situation that's beyond that first person, and like that's a problem that I have with it, because to me the way to look at a conversation, which is nearly impossible, but from a conceptual standpoint it's much easier to talk about than actually living it, like actually having a conversation where you're able to actually do that, is being aware of the context in which that person is coming from. And it's so hard to know, You know, like for example, this conversation that we're all having online. I don't know what any of you guys are doing before going into this, you know? Like you guys could be like someone could be like being a peeping Tom right now for all I know. And like in on this conversation on this call, just listening in, uh, you know, it's very hard to actually know. You could have your own objective truth, but again, that's just part of your own subjective field, and it's not really even penetrating the the reality of what's happening. And it's very hard, if not impossible, to penetrate that reality because you don't know the context, you know, unless, you know, not everybody gets on the net, Daniel, and says, well, I've been doing this, this, and this, and me and the family and the kids, we were doing all this. And like, I've like a pretty well, or like a weekly email of like, I kind of know what Daniel's doing during the week, you know, like or what he's reading or what he's about. So there's like an easy way of understanding you because there is this context that's so vulnerable and transparent that I have access to, or so I think. And I think this ties into what Dimitri was saying about where to start with philosophy and the different schools. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with anything that was said, honestly, but the different schools are just contextually different. That's why there are different schools. There's the British school because they're in Britain. Things happen differently in Britain than they do in Japan. And that's why there's the, you know, Kyoto school and this, that, and the third. And I think they have their own different, like you said, Daniel, approaches to metaphysics, but those different approaches are necessarily different because they're in a different context. And that just, it's the same thing with why where to start with philosophy is so hard is because I don't know the person asking the question, where to start with philosophy, I don't know what context they're coming from. So it's so hard to actually give an answer. So it's like, you're like very crudely, I think this is a bit broad, but I think it gets the point across. If you're wondering where you get your knowledge from, it's like, okay, well, maybe you should start with Bertrand Russell, The Problem with Philosophy. You know, if you're wondering about love and other things, maybe it's like Plato's Phaedrus. You know, it's very hard to say, and it's even hard, I think, for the person who was curious about philosophy to know exactly why they're even curious in real time. It's like, ironically, only after reading philosophy and being able to digest something that is philosophical are you even able to make a, oh God, the dogs are barking. Sorry, I gotta run across the street real quick.
Then Luber was eaten. No, go on. I don't know your context right now. Oh God, he's bleeding. Go on.
I'm dying, but I just need to finish my thought before I go. I think it's almost like you need to have like a therapy session before you even before you even understand where you even want to start. It's either that or you just start in an arbitrary sense somewhere, and through starting you can reflect upon the start and then actually get your true start in a certain sense. It's I think it works in an ironic way like that. But I will say, in the world that we live in, a little quick riff, a little tangent. In the world that we live in, where it's very much epistemologically speaking correspondence, like I think Bertrand Russell is a very good place to start, and then from there jumping to a continental philosopher that absolutely breaks that up, like getting such a grip. Like I think I loved Bertrand Russell in college, like after reading like Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, like Bertrand Russell to me was like way easier to understand, way more applicable to life itself, like less like armchair like. But only until I got to that point did I even realize the value of like a Spinoza, which is ironic because I didn't read Russell first at all. I read Spinoza first. But anyway, back to what I'm saying. I think we need to get to a place where before we even have a conversation, we have a pre-conversation about what the conversation even should be about, based off of getting to the bottom of what context you're even coming from. So I think there needs to be a first conversation about even understanding what context you're coming from. And then from there, you can actually have a real conversation, because every party can actually interpenetrate the other person's subjective field more likely, in my opinion. So I think Heidegger does this in a very passive way when he, piles everybody in the same narrative of forgetting about being. And in that sense, because you put everybody in the same context, which is they're forgetting about being, you're able to have a better conversation amongst the different philosophers from that point of view. So I do think what I'm getting from this is to actually break up the idle talk, philosophical talk, the ivory tower versus the commonplace. You have to have a conversation about where you're coming from. You have to acknowledge, I'm coming from the ivory tower. This is what it's like in the ivory tower. And because this is what it's like in the ivory tower, I want to talk to somebody else about what it's like. And then the other party does the same from where they're coming from. And I think it has to be very vulnerable and personal at first, even though the intention going into it isn't vulnerable and personal at all. It could be intellectual or just for the sake of understanding. And a lot of people, I think, will push back on that because it seems stupid and pointless to be like, hey, how was your day? What'd you do today? When we're all going on the net knowing that we want to talk about philosophy or science or something that's about understanding itself. And I think it's hard to get there, but I'll stop my riff. This has been great so far.
No, I want to talk about how you're going to survive the dogs, or not. I'm not sure. I don't want you to. We're going to talk about how to save you from bleeding out, which is probably philosophically significant, because why bother if you don't seek the true, the beautiful, and the good to bother yourself from bleeding out? So maybe there is a philosophical. And so,
real quick, have you ever seen that South Park episode with the dog whisperer, the dog whisperer?
No, I have not.
Well, if you have, I am the dog whisperer. That's all. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Congratulations, Mr. Luber. You've come a long way. I think there's a lot there that's very important. So first off, perhaps a way to start, and then I'll give it to Michael, Michelle, Mr. Jockin, and Mr. Murphy. Perhaps there's something about starting philosophy and with thinkers who share your context or your historic age. So let's say we buy the language of fourth turning that some people use, how he'll talk about that. Well, maybe starting with philosophers who were writing during a fourth turning would be useful, right? Or to write with thinkers for whom, if you're very concerned, like your historic moment can help situate because you have a shared context, and you should start with people that have the shared context because there might be connection there. That might be one angle to take it on. I think this idea on what you're talking about, the pre-talk, it's quite fascinating, because how do you have a pre-talk? Like, how do you do that? Hey, I just met you. Let's talk about like the basis of understanding that we come from. Yeah, you're not going to meet me again. And then the person leaves. Like, in of itself, the very talking about the need for a pre-talk has a philosophical feel to it, even if you're trying to do it to kind of avoid philosophy in the purest sense, right? So how do you avoid that kind of conundrum? Well, what's very interesting is I think the surprise has something pre to it. Because when you hit a surprise and something breaks, then this is why, like when I think of subjective destitution, I think of surprise. And I kind of think about, instead of like the homo, it's like humans are homo surprise us. Surprise us is not a Latin term, but I'm going to use it here. Like we talk about humans as the rational animal. I actually think we're the surprised animal. It's not just simply instinct react. Like we have this capacity of intellectual surprise and getting good at intellectual surprise and then forming character relative to that encounter, and surprise is actually like where all the action is. Like surprise is really fundamental for what it means to be human, not merely rational, not merely logical, but the ability to respond to a surprise. And I think like the necessity of small talk, if you will, is precisely to find the point of surprise that then breaks apart the talk, that forces you from the middle to consider the pre. Like, you kind of see this in theology, right? Like, you always have to consider the origin from the middle. And the only, like, you're always like in the middle of something considering what got it started. And so there's a way in which we intentionally have to screw up to consider the conversation before the conversation that we didn't have, but we wouldn't have even been able to frame to have unless we were already in the middle of something, right? And so I think a lot of times when people talk about idle talk, they actually are suggesting, I don't know where this is going, which very often human beings don't know where something is going if they don't know where they've been. So there's a sense of, I don't have a sense of the origin in this conversation. Likewise, I don't have a sense of the teleology of this conversation. When people don't know where something is going, it tends to be a mixture. The intensity of that feeling is tied to if they know where they're going, but they don't know the origin, or they know the origin, but they don't know where they're going. But the most intense form is when they don't know where they're going or where they've been from, right? And that's where the feeling of a pre-talk is needed, but then also a meaning is needed. And it seems like human beings are the kind of beings that can only even have the revelation of needing both of those from the middle of the thing. Well, if you're in the middle of the thing, then that means there's a certain subjective destitution that has to occur in the middle of it. But subjective destitution, as Lacan and them talks about, for me, always has to be tied to the surprise. And I think the Das Ding of this, as Tyler talked about in his wonderful Theory Underground presentation, gets at this. It has to be from the point of surprise that then kind of opens you up for the reconsideration of the origin that made this possible and its directionality, of which means you basically have to have a wound to have a direction. So I think humans are the kinds of beings that have to be wounded to know where to go. But then we often get wounded and destroyed by that wound, or we become bitter toward the person that wounded us, versus seeing the relationships and the wounds that come from it as the necessary precondition to take seriously the origin and our directionality. And so we don't blame the other person for that wound, but see it more ontological. Like we see it, no. The nature of the human being is that they only get direction when they are wounded, once something has been broken. And yes, it was this person who did that, but it would have been anyone else just as easily. Or I would have never even asked questions about origin or direction. And I think if you can ontologize, which is not a term, but I'm going to use it, if you can make ontological pain, if you can make it deeper, then that actually brings it to the place where it can bring forth this horizon that you're describing. But very often, rather than making it ontological, we make it personal. And sure, the person does have personal responsibility, but when you do that, instead of asking questions of future and origin, you ask questions of how do I get away from that person? And that instead, and yeah, maybe they're the kind of person that is you really do need to get away from, but there's a different sort of orientation. There's a different sort of way where you're actually trying to position yourself to consider future and origin so that you can move. So maybe that's tied to the question of the idle talk, but let me give it to Michael here. Michael, please.
Yeah, this has all been really great. First of all, before I say anything of, or attempt to say anything of substance, I have to say, Michelle, your jacket is so cool. It is, and the butterfly pin, it's amazing. But yeah, on this point of like, you're welcome. On this point of context and the importance of having that free talk, I think one of the biggest, it seems like one of the biggest triggers for anger, and I really didn't want to bring up the anger saga again. I was like, before this, I was like, no, it's over. But it's seeping out apparently. So feel free to use your anger to rebuke this discussion of anger and shut it down. But I think one of the biggest triggers of anger is the presumption of a shared context based on a shared identity, when that shared context is not necessarily like apparently obvious. So like, I think why so many people seem to be rebelling from, something like postmodernism is this presumption of like a monolith of, okay, we're all from this shared identity group, therefore we have this shared context, therefore we're all coming from the same place, and we, approach all these political and social issues from the same place, and relate to each other ontologically the same way. Like, because we're, say, Japanese, we come from this very communal context where we value family, so on and so forth. And it's like, depending on where you are in the country, depending on if you're an immigrant to another country, like your context is obviously dependent. Even we can all notice, like, even within our own family systems, like siblings are incredibly different. And you can hold all other variables the same. They can have the same experiences or very similar experiences, and they can come out of it completely different and viewing the world completely differently. And so I think that discussion about context is so vital, because it really allows people to feel like they're truly being seen, or at least the other person is making an attempt to kind of dispel with their presumptions or their kind of complexes and biases around someone else. And I think that's really great. And it was just kind of making me think about this phenomenology of anger again, and how it seems like I just know for myself, like when either I or someone presumes something about another based on kind of just surface level characteristics, or a once-off interaction where someone said something and like the term, taking it out of context, is like literally kind of the opposite of what we're saying, right? It's like kind of making a distortion of or a reduction of the context. And yeah, like I said something a while back in a net session of like, it seems like what makes a space like this so like unique is that we're having an intention to have an intention. And what's so interesting is like, none of us really had like a pre-talk before we all, came together. It's like new people filter in week by week, and filter out. And like, I mean, obviously, like, we all have a connection to Daniel in some way, shape, or form. And he, I don't know how his vetting process works for getting us into the net. I don't know how detailed the security briefing is to get us into this exclusive group. But like, it's not like we all like came together and we're like, oh, we like, we all like this philosopher, or we all like, value this thing, and like, okay, like, let's bring this group of people together around that shared context. But like, the context seems to be something like, what Javier was saying about like the difference between idle talk and deep talk is like having the presence of God. Like, it seems like there's like a presence of something beyond us and beyond the conversation that we're all kind of groping towards. And there's like a mutual respect about our individual and collective like movement towards that. And we might use different languages, and we might be climbing up different trees. But like there seems to be a baseline level of like appreciation for the input that everyone brings that affords that movement. It's like, it's the opposite of a debate in that sense. And so that's kind of interesting to think about. It's like, some spaces or some relationships, it seems like it's necessary to have a very intentional pre-talk. And then some spaces, it's just kind of the vibe or the openness of everyone involved that it seems to not really be necessary. But it's there, but it's like, it doesn't need to be explicitly explicated out. Last thing I'll say, I'll bring this like several notches below from talking about, philosophers and where to start in philosophy. I strained my neck a couple of days ago, and it's like been really painful, and I'm basically been bedridden. So that means I've been watching a whole lot of Star Wars. And it's funny, like, watching these movies from your youth, like after you've gone through like your own meaning crisis, and you just like see it from like a totally different perspective. And I was like, oh, like the path to becoming a Jedi is basically just like becoming a Buddhist. Like, it's like it's so it's like so apparent that it's like, like don't attach to your thoughts, like, don't let your anger, your fear cloud your judgment, like all of these things. And it was really interesting to like look at it from that lens. And I've there's been certain things about Buddhism, even though it was like my entry point into philosophy, that I've kind of been grappling with and questioning, namely this kind of idea of like non-attachment, because I think it can get warped into kind of like the spiritual bypassing thing of kind of just like dispensing with your emotions. And so I've just been chewing on that as it's pertaining to anger. I mean, there's nothing like, I'm on a shit ton of drugs right now, so like there's nothing really intelligent coming out of that inquiry, but it's there. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
Well, I hope your neck gets better, because that sucks, and you're still beautiful and wonderful on drugs. So well done. I'll pass it to Michelle, Jockin, Mr. Murphy, and Mr. Cashier as a quick note. I do wonder on the differences. Also, if anyone wants to come to the garage, we have the Star Wars movie on VHS and a VHS system that we can watch it, because that's what we made the kids watch it on. No freaking way we get Blu-ray. Come on. When I was a kid, we watched this on VHS and the TV with literally, actually, my brothers and I made a metal antenna that we put on a TV, and it freaking worked. We got Mysterious Channel 27 with all of the weird cartoons at 4 o'clock on Wednesday. Oh, I'm telling you. Anyway, there seems to be a difference between what's the difference between non-attachment for surprise and non-attachment not to be surprised? Because I think that gets at the difference. Because there's a certain non-attachment so you're ready for surprise. So you're not so held to something that if a surprise occurs, it destroys you. But then there's a non-attachment so that you're not surprised. And I'm more and more of the opinion that surprise is the core of what it is to be human. One's orientation to surprise. And surprise, of course, if we're really talking about otherness, face dusting, it is always surprising, or else it's merely an idea, right? So there's something there, like a relationship is surprising or it's mechanic. I also think anger is actually very appropriate to bring into this, because I actually think the moment someone says this is idle talk or what are we talking about, what is that? There's always a kind of hint of anger there, right? And we also talked in the past how anger is a break of the social field. So when someone says, why are we talking about this? They're feeling a break in the social field, usually because they can't connect to what's being said, right? Like, so there's an anger in this is stupid. Like the philosopher who says small talk is dumb. It's what? There's a kind of anger. I think a lot of times when the philosopher doesn't like small talk, it's not that they can't connect with it, but they don't want to connect with it because they know it's a place of landmines, of social surveillance or anger or stuff. So they're like, this is, a lot of times when you're like small talk, it's dumb. It's because it's like, it's dumb to have this kind of conversation that risks pain and misunderstanding and anger and hurt, right? Whereas like someone who doesn't do philosophy might be like, philosophy is dumb because like, you're not talking, like, what's the point, right? So one of them is from a place of like, what's the point? And the other is avoiding landmines, I think sometimes is part of it. I think also too, as just a note, I think like it is interesting that I think people always go into a conversation with a sense of its possibilities. And often when you go in, like when you know certain people are coming over, you already know if there's a pretty good chance if there's going to be a fight or if it's going to be a lot of fun. Just by who they are, right? There's a sense in which the pre-talk always happens just by virtue of knowing the person. If this person is coming to visit, this is going to be a stressful week. If this person's coming to visit, this is going to be great, right? And what is the quality of that knowledge? I do sometimes wonder if it's basically, there's a chance of belly laughing. Like that's actually what we mean when we talk about death. There's a chance of belly laughing. Or like interestingness, or like that. It's like, this is idle talk because I don't see any possibility of belly laughing. Oh, this is a good conversation because there's really a possibility of belly laughing or something really fun happening, right? And that's, again, the difference between idle talk or the talk you enjoy then is the sense of the quality of its possibilities that could surprise you ahead of time. And you're entering into the space where a belly laugh can happen, where like something really engaging. But I definitely think like when you know, when you know, it's not even that they're necessarily a comedian, but you know that belly laughing is possible, then you look forward to it. And that seems to be often when people say, why are we talking about this? Or why there's a lower chance of belly laughing. Like this real sort of like letting loose is not possible here. And I think a lot of times people's favorite philosophy conversations are not simply about philosophy. It's a certain letting looseness. There's a certain letting looseness that is actually, oh, here's where we can talk about philosophy, and we don't have to have read all of the philosophers. We don't have to know all the citations. We can just kind of let loose and let our kind of have this free play of interest, right? The belly laugh is a sign of free play of interest, right? Because you can't really, like, there are certain people you don't really feel like you can belly laugh with, because they'll look at you weird or be like, what are you doing? And you also can't get yourself worked up to that place of fun, right? And so that might be, the possibility of the belly laugh. Maybe the belly laugh is more of what people use as a sense versus truth, right? Because Javier was making that point. Like when you're in a conversation, it's not really where you like, oh, we're approaching the truth or something. There's more of a like, if there's the possibility of belly laughing, then there actually is, that alone is a sign of approaching truth. And I think a lot of the greats actually knew that. Like the presence of the possibility of belly laughing is actually a more powerful indication of approaching truth than just logic, actually. That there's actually some deeper proof in that. That would have to be expanded on, but let me give it to Michelle here. Michelle, please. I like your coat and your butterfly as well. I love you.
Well, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Well, just because I'm using the little speaker earpiece thing. But it was great to see you all. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. Yeah, it's a great topic. And I don't know why, but when Luber brought that up with his mom, I thought about this particular scene or memory I have when I was in Lima, Peru, and I was in a car with my twin sister, a friend who's a boy, and his mom, and the mom was driving. Heads up, Lima traffic is crazy. It's just unlike anything I've ever experienced, even though I've lived near big cities or in big cities before for time periods of my life. So basically we had a lot of time, right, where we're just waiting in this traffic in Lima, and I don't remember where we were even going. I don't recall those details. I just remember sitting in the car together, and like this, my friend Pablo was just talking about like philosophical questions basically, and the mom was basically saying like, why does this matter? I don't know why we're talking about this stuff. But also we had like this time on our hands in this car, right? Like I guess we could have done a sing along, like we could have put on some music, we could have sung songs, we could have just sat there in silence. We could have talked about like, learned more about their family history. I mean, my twin sister and I are pretty curious, so we'll ask lots of questions. I think, you know what? Oh my gosh, so much is coming back to my mind now about this conversation. We ended up talking about the afterlife and like, is there such a thing as the afterlife? And again, I think the mom's position was kind of like, I don't see why we need to, like, she was offering her own ideas, but there was also a skepticism for like why it mattered. But again, we had this time, we were just stuck in Lima traffic. And so anyways, all of this was like floating back into my mind as Luber was talking. And I guess I bring that up to say that, quality of conversation seems to be a big factor in like our quality of life in general. I'm not saying like we have to talk in order to have a quality of life, but we probably are going to talk at some point. We're going to have conversations. And so if it's going to occur, then the quality does matter. Just because, and I think like what Daniel was mentioning with the landmines, what that to me represents is that there does seem to be something a bit more risky with the gossip idle chatter, because it's just gets so quickly. I don't know if I'm just like a very non-confrontational type of person. It's probably a weakness, but there's also something about realizing people are just kind of constantly like, they just like talking smack, and they kind of like just worrying about what this person, blah, blah, blah. This person's doing it like the only topic people seem to want to talk about or gravitate towards talking about is other people, or what's on the news, or maybe what they did today. That can also be part of it as well. And I brought this up with Philip and Christopher on our conversation on Volturiard. But the point of the matter is, I'm bringing all of this up to say that there is, I think if we think about like the quality of the conversation, that can be helpful, because then it's less about like, are we being philosophical? Are we not being philosophical? It's more about like, I mean, maybe this does relate to your belly laugh, Daniel, where there's a potential for joy. Like there's a potential for it to be like good, enjoyable. Like people like it. It's nice. It's a nice thing to do and share with each other. And I do feel as though I've typically heard it more so the people saying, oh, philosophy is I don't know, like I've heard people say those comments like, oh, well, we're getting deep now or blah, blah, blah. I don't usually hear it the other way around as much. Now, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Like you're saying, Daniel, there's people who get kind of, I would say snooty, and be like, oh, well, we can't talk about football games or, going to the shop this morning or something because it's just, so yeah, it's obviously there's a ditch on either side of the road. But I do wonder with people who criticize the kinds of more deeper conversations, if that's more just from a place of not understanding that type of quality yet, or not experiencing that type of quality yet, or something like that. Because when I heard too, when Luber said something like, well, the gossip, well, that's what really matters right now, right? What we might call gossip. Well, that's what really matters. My friend might be mad at me, or she's thinking this, or I have to, I have to go to a party and I have to, whatever. It's true. It's very salient and it's very real. But why, like, there's a part of me that almost thinks you'd need philosophy to realize, like, should that matter to my life so much that I'm so consumed by it, Now, obviously, philosophical questions can be just as consuming in a possibly negative way, I suppose. At the same time, I think you do need some like degree of stepping back to actually assess the quality. Like, what's the quality like when I end up gossiping, or if I talk about other people, or if I do the whole meta dimension of thinking about even just a very quotidian thing that then you end up kind of like, for example, I'll just give you a very concrete example. Okay, I took the kids to a boutique this morning to get like little gift exchange items for our cousins. And for me, it makes me think about gift giving, right? It makes me think about mystery and how things have changed over time with gift giving, because we have wish lists, we have online shopping, and is it better to get something for someone that you know for sure they want, or is it maybe more interesting to not know what they want and get them something? Like, these are the questions that are going through my head. What I mean to say by that is you can take the very quotidian things and start to reflect on them in ways that at least I find interesting. Maybe no one else cares, and that's fine. Nobody needs to care about it. But I do think it's fascinating to consider those types of things. And to me, that's going to lead to less landmines, right? Then did this person want this? Oh, was it over budget? Is somebody going to be upset? Like all of that minutia, which I guess some people love that terrain of conversation. But anyways, this isn't really adding like anything different. But I just really kind of wanted to bring up maybe the one thing that's kind of different is just thinking about quality, quality of conversation. And again, I also like what you brought up, Javier, about the presence of God, because one time Daniel and I were talking about, I wish I remember which mystic, it's a female mystic. And she was basically, Daniel was like, yeah, I think a lot of what people's numbers, like in general, that perspective of understanding that the presence of God actually amplifies and brings the real qualia or qualitative difference means that we have to sort of get a lot more discerning with what we do talk about and don't talk about, what we value as exchange and, filling up our sort of like need for communication. Because if like we're constantly seeking communication, but we're not communing with God or having that communion of his presence, then it makes it much more risky, right? Or, possibly, I want to say not having as much quality ultimately, or being kind of this insatiable type of desire to just getting back a message or hearing back from somebody and getting kind of slowly but surely hooked on that, right? Versus really tapping into what communication is all about in the first place. It's about the communing. And so, which is sometimes conversation and sometimes it's silence, sometimes it's eating, sometimes it's dancing or singing or laughing. So anyways, I just wanted to add that. Thank you all so much.
I think that's one. And the stuff you brought up on gift, I mean, that's really important. I'll give it to Jockin, Murphy, and Kashir and Michael here, is that Like, is not the difference between a gift and just using another person? Because if I say, I want this, aren't I kind of just using you as my, like, fetcher? Go fetch this thing for me that I want and won't be surprised by. The difference between fetching and gifting is surprise, right? And if for it to be a good gift, it's a testament to intimacy. Because I knew what you wanted that you didn't know you wanted, and I was able to find it and surprise you. I really do think when you get this culture of merely telling people what you want, and it's not really gift giving, it's fetching. And in a sense, commoditizing people to be machines. I'm just using you as my Amazon, like, I don't know, like helper, like you're my helper. You're going to go do the Amazon order for me so that I don't have to, and we can go through the simulacra of Christmas. For me, when you remove surprise like this, Christmas does become a Baudrillard kind of freaking simulacra. It's the lack of the surprise. But what is a gift? Surprise means what? Risk. It means, oh, also, the reason people don't like gifts as opposed to fetching is it might unveil that I don't know you. Because I thought you liked this and you don't? Oh, crap. I'd rather just keep it in the kind of vague ambiguity of getting what I know you like and fetching for you so we can maintain the plausible deniability of intimacy and self-knowledge, right? Now, that's pretty cynical, but there is something about the risk of a gift that unveils the truth of a relationship. And if I'm not able to surprise you in a manner that you find good, it risks unveiling something I don't want to unveil, right? So there's a true risk in the gift, right? So it's always surprise. For me, surprise is the defining quality of basically everything that makes it human or not, like makes it Nick Land or not. It's always going to be the surprise. If it's not surprising, AI does it better. It's an artificial intelligence. We've kind of made gift-giving artificial intelligence as fetching, right? But we did that because we don't want to get hurt, right? And so we do that with conversation. We want to know ahead of time what we're talking about. We want to have a point. We want to have an objective. So conversing is merely exchanging data. Most conversation is not conversation, it's data exchange, right? And that means we have a, so because another thing that you brought out is people like, what's the point? Part of the fact you do philosophy is because there is no point, and thus you get habituated to doing things without a point, so you're not a slave of points. You're not a slave of utility and pragmatism, right? Because ultimately, if you are only allowed to do things that have a point, Nick Land wins. Because the whole logic of capital and the commodity and the economy is that the only things you're allowed to do are that of which are quantifiable and have a point. Well, therefore, the human is removed, right? Like the very capacity to do something that does not have an obvious point means we have an intelligence that is not reducible to, well, ChatGPT and putting in a prompt and getting the outcome, right? Like there's a certain surpriseness that makes us human, right? But why that is really important from a game theory dynamic comes out in something you said that's really, really important. What did the person say who gossips? They say, well, this is what matters, not philosophy. The gossip matters, right? In a very real way, the meaning crisis, if we use that language, is not a lack of meaning. It's the fact that everything presents itself as meaningful and we don't have a clear heuristic to determine which meaning to organize our action, right? Like emotions seem meaningful. Gossip seems meaningful. Philosophy seems, it's not that these things don't have meaning. It's a sense in which they don't have meaning because you don't know which one to bring forth out of the other, making an appearance of none of them having meaning, but it's because they all have meaning and you have no heuristic to pick one versus any of them. So it's as if they don't have meaning, right? Because you don't have a sorting mechanism. Well, here's the funny thing. The only way you can determine which meaning to bring forth, which thing that is meaningful to bring forth over the others, by definition, must be through a meaningless activity. The activity by which you decide which meaning to bring forth must itself be something that doesn't have a clear point, or else it would be another option contributing to the rational impasse, right? It would just be another thing that you couldn't decide which to do or not, right? So if you've got a bunch of things like gossip or philosophy or traveling or work, all of these have meaning, and you're trying to decide which one of those to focus on and organize your activity, the very principle of making that decision itself could not be one of those meaningful options, or it'd be contributing to the inability to make a decision, right? So you actually have to do something that doesn't have a point to train yourself to be able to determine which point to choose. So if you never do anything that doesn't have a point, then you're never going to be trained into choosing points. Points will choose you. And when they choose you, then you are going to be serving the economic system, the AI, or whatever, right? So that's also the irony, is that in order to be human, you have to do the pointless, because the human is the being of whom chooses their points versus have the points choose them. But that means you have to do something embarrassing. something that people think is silly, something that you cannot justify. If you never in your life do something you cannot justify, then you are not going to be able to choose the things by which you justify with your life. But that means there's a certain subjective destitution or irony or paradox that is at the beginning, the pre-talk, the pre-point that opens the possibility of points that you are not a slave to, that you are not merely fetching, but experiencing as a gift. And I think when you have that quality, the belly laugh becomes possible. So I'm talking about belly laughs today like Santa, but let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
This is the problem. When I come in late, the problem is the notes get overwhelming, and now I have to sit here and decide if I'm going to narrate through my 4 pages of notes, or I'm going to try to synthesize this. So I'm going to go for synthesizing. Let's start at the beginning. I'll start from the top. So I want to, so I'm reading Hippocrates. I'm reading Hippocrates right now for medicine, and I find it very interesting. The thing that always lampoons the Greeks and gets everybody they get beat up from a modern science point of view is this discussion, not their metaphysical models a lot, way more their material physical sciences. That's where they get beat up because of the model they're using. The hot and the cold, the wet and the dry, the humors, that kind of stuff, phlegm, that kind of thing. That is what usually gets them beat up, is that model they're using is false. Thus, the usual attack of ancient philosophy is, well, wait a minute, if they're wrong on that, why are they wrong on all the other things? Now I say this just against Hippocrates. The big thing with him is that his essays about talking about medicine is because the measures are very qualitative, very time qualitative based. He has to rely a lot on that. And is using the model that he has to operate with, the hot and the cold, the wet and the dry. He has to use a lot of argumentation by prediction. Basically, by demonstrating by prediction that this account gives a prediction of what's going to happen, this gives validity to the patient. That's the presentation it's given right from the get-go. I just find that interesting. That's a very contemporary position of knowledge, to say that really knowledge is ultimately just being power to predict, to give a model of causation and to show high correspondence of prediction from this model. That's really no different than what was done back in the Greeks. It's just a different model. That's what's changed. There's other things I could say about that, because to be fair, Aristotle's known for his induction model. That's what it's most famously for. What gets him in trouble, or just the whole point, is that induction model induction requires a model to infer from. And some of them are a lot stronger than others. The hot, cold, wet, dry model doesn't work so good. How does it? But the actuality and potential is useful. We use it all the time. It's take it for granted. Or another intermediate one, maybe the 4 causes. But, this note I was thinking about, that's just one area note. And that is related to the idea of necessary signs and prediction. So that was that part of the story, or that idea. The other part is this idea of the kind of idle talk and the kind of problem of thought we're talking about, basically from observations. Is it basically from an embedded subject, or is it from a system? I wrote my note here, the weight of words. What is the weight of our words? What is the substance of it? What is its significance? That's what I wrote a note about. And that relates to what Daniel, you note about connection, kind of loss of connection. Because the thing you're bringing up is, any conversation, when you're not in a discipline or not within a certain context, is going to be meaningless. It actually has no value whatsoever. Like, if I don't follow a sport, you have no way to follow what I'm talking about. You have no idea the significance of what's happening here. So all the way down, there's accounts all the way through of connection. So when you're being interjected, I'm not seeing the point of this. Well, yeah, because there's a breakage of communion that's happening there. And your point about if philosophizing is useless or not, it really kind of, and this is what I want to bring up. So I do agree that there's definitely, I think, a lot of contemporary thinkers, or us in this room, probably all of us had some wound of failure that made us had a break. And I had a note of, it didn't work. Like, that's kind of the thing. The kind of norms or kind of cultural information we get given doesn't work. It breaks. And there you go. And I can think of a lot of online cultures are derivative from that. For example, the red pill or things like that. That comes from the gendered courtship norms that was taught or presented were breaking. And there was a cultural, social movements to deal with that or respond to it. I'm just reminding of that. But there's another side of that. But I only answer that's the kind of privational state, right? It's a response in a privational state. There is another side I want to interject that I think corresponds with it. I'm not saying it's in contention of the breakage, the wound of failure. It's the inspiration of the beautiful. When you see something, when you see a exemplar that I want to be like them, that obviously works when you're in a state of usually of some privation, especially if you're going to be in a state of lack and you see something presented to you that has this abundance, a possibility, reveals to you a new possibility you didn't consider before. I say this because going into my discipline, typography, type design, was because I encountered a designer. I didn't know it existed before. I encountered him as my teacher. I literally went from not knowing the thing existed. I had a moment of surprise to my entire orientation to my life changed from that encounter. And great education tends to have that quality. People come in not even aware of this possibility. They see a new possibility that wasn't there before, and it reorients their entire life, how they're going to live their life. So that's a kind of fulfillment, or kind of like a kind of secondary property of the woundedness. It's somewhat, it could be that, or it could be just straight up like you're just in a state of indifference. This is almost like kind of when anxiety is sometimes this is kind of overwhelm a possibility. You don't even know where to go. You even know where to go, like what direction to angle in. You're kind of stuck in this kind of conundrum of indefiniteness. And this exemplar appears that gives you a reference to orient and go in this direction. I think that's really telling. I think that's really interesting to talk about that, especially that because that line of thought came up because of the line from Aristotle Metaphysics of the beginning of philosophy is wonder. So how can we explain this difference of this kind of this brokenness state of philosophy versus this wonder state from Aristotle? And I think this idea of a kind of beatific vision, surprise, might be one way to articulate that. Just a thought, just meditating on that part. With that said, this idea of measure is, Javier and yourself, Daniel, I think it's quite, and especially the belly laugh, because measures, we've had this whole mistaking, there's been a historical development about number becoming measure. Not necessarily, not always the case. And in fact, a lot of the measures, it can be qualitative, and that kind of heuristics are built this way, in the sense of, am I going to have a belly laugh in this encounter? It's a very good heuristic. And we were talking yesterday on our call together, Daniel, about the idea of, for example, keeping one's word. If I keep track of how many, that's a kind of variation where there isn't, you could count that. How many times am I making promises, and how often am I fulfilling those promises? I'd make a good prediction that if the ratio of times you fulfilled your promises went up, your quality of your life will be improved. That would be an example. But the belly laugh is that's even more qualitative. There's no ratio number attached to that possible necessarily, or maybe you count how many conversations have I had that I had a belly laugh versus not. But with that said, measurers, we have a bad mistake sometimes of relying on quantified number measurements as the measure. But measures don't necessarily have to be that. A person can be a measure. A state, an activity can be a measure. And kind of what Michelle said about gossip or backbiting, kind of sense what you feel like after the experience. Those are measures. How did I feel after this experience? And I know that, and it's interesting from boxing. Now I'm going to vibe for a sec on this point, because I know from boxing, when something's not working, like I'm doing a combination, I know it's not working, right? And I got to adjust this. It's this kind of attunement. And then I know it works. I felt it. There's a change in feeling, usually sound and feeling, usually of the heavy bag or where my body is in position. There's the certain tension flows the right way. I'm balanced. I was able to have it fly through me. That's me articulating through the kind of measure qualitative look that I'm evaluating as I'm practicing in boxing. These are examples. There's no number to that. In theory, you could measure my EKG, muscle tension, and all the other stuff. You could do other things like looking in a mirror. That's why a lot of boxing gyms have mirrors, because you're looking at your balance. You're at your boxing, shadow boxing, whatever. You're looking in the mirror because you're evaluating your position as you're boxing. So those are signs. Those are images. I'm also reminded of things like, for example, when doctors look at X-rays, I tell you, I'm never looking. I never see a doctor looks at an X-ray. I'm like, how can you tell that? Like something's broken or like this is that. I'm like, I have no idea. I just see a bunch of splotches up there, and you see all this structure, this anatomy, structure, or orientation, and when there's something broken or something dysfunctioned, you can tell from an X-ray. I can't. That's an example again of a count, like an account and a measure changed based on our participation of kinds of knowledge. I think the last note, I don't disagree, Dan, your point about like the kind of idle talk as a way to socially coordinate people and regulate. Don't disagree with that. I think another side of it too, and it kind of like, you know what's funny? Like when that happens, in one sense you could feel attacked because you're like, why are you impeding on me? The other side is, why are you being lame? Like part of a good conversation is to be able to vibe. Like it's actually kind of one though. Actually, here's a good sign to show how your quality of life is. Can you have a conversation without an intent? Like without that that feeling of drive of you need an objective. We got to talk about work. We got to know where we're going. It's actually that's a sign of social disorder. You can't vibe. You're something wrong. There's something significantly wrong in your social coordination, your ability to be a social animal. Like there's something significantly wrong. That'd be an example, another measure, right? That's kind of a mode of qualitative. We talked about this yesterday. Idea of like, can you go for a walk without in a mental loop, going through your mind, just in a loop in your mind? Can you actually enjoy the walk if you're on a hike, for example? That's a similar thing. It's this idea like, can you release your intention? Can you release intention to be towards attention, right? Kind of like I kind of talk with Javier. Aquinas has this 4-part model of intention, will, action, and object. I've always felt like there's a missing step, which is attention, meaning there's some things that you're not even aware of. Like there's, if you use a modern like subconsciousness, there's things that are there in the background that you can release the muscle, the mind slightly, or enough that you can like let things pass through. And I kind of like, and that's part of this whole conversation. What Michael was saying about this group, it's a vibe group. You know, we're all coming with different accounts, and we're seeing what responds. We're seeing what resonates, what we're vibing with, and kind of like playing off each other what our conversations are or what our ideas are. That is something positive. If you're locked in trying to talk about your model and trying to understand, you can't do this. This is not, the free play is not possible. If that's the case. Woo, again, lots of notes. I apologize because I think there's something very important here about natures of measure. That's very significant because there's a very sophisticated approach that I think philosophy is one of the best goals of philosophy is finding those measures. How do we articulate when the common understandings fail us? How can we re-articulate the measures of how we should live our lives? This is also why philosophy always ends up, it's supposed to end in ethics. It's supposed to end there, right? Ethics, political science. It's about how we're supposed to live our lives, right? And it's buttressed by how do we know things, and what is the nature of reality, ontology and nature and science, ontology and metaphysics, things like that. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for humoring me. There's a lot of notes. This has been a great conversation.
No, I think that's magnificent. I'll give it to Tyler. I mean, that idea of looking for non-obvious measures, I think that's a lot of it. Because also I've always taken philosophy starts in wonder. That's like two ways, right? You're like, how the heck did things go so wrong? Wonder, like you're wondering, crap, things went bad. And then wonder in the sense of, wow, how could that exist? Isn't it funny how there's a wondering of, how could I have been that stupid? And then there's a wondering of, how could that exist that's so magnificent? Or how did that happen? Like there's a certain, love you, Javier. I hope you find the candy canes I hid. The kids can't because I'm a good dad. Anyway, there's a wonder of like disaster and a wonder of like beauty. And both of those means I need a different measure. Like I need a different heuristic of decision making. Wonder brings with that. If this exists, then I need a different measure of being. And if this could happen, that's so bad, that was led to because everyone had their ideas of the good, and here we ended up, I need a different measure. I think that's a lot of it. I think that's very powerful. I also think it is tied to modeling because there is a way in which you're doing philosophy. I think a lot like you're trying to kind of almost keep an invisible model in front of you. Like you have a sense, or maybe you saw something, you're like, I like that. Or you had a convert, you're like, this is the vibe I want. How do I keep this thing in front of me? because it has this slippage, right? Because it's an invisible metric or it's not clear. So you're trying to like keep in front of you the revelations of the fullest forms of life and the better ways to live, and they're not in front of you like the computer screen. You're trying to keep a model in front of you in the absence of a visible model, if you will. You're trying to keep looking at something. I think that's very powerful. I think also, to your point, like, yeah, like when people say it's idle talk, for example, it's not that like, we've only made 3 steps toward the truth after an hour. This is really inefficient. By now, we should have made 8 steps toward the truth. No one is speaking from a quantitative assessment, even though that's how they act. I quantified this conversation, and it has only made us take 3 steps toward the truth, and it's only improved our relationship by 10%. This is a bad conversation. Nobody does that. It's all an assessment of the quality. There's a certain quality that is off. And I think what you were saying about vibing, not having an intention, it just makes me that, yes, basically the best social coordination is a kind of surprise coordination. You're able to coordinate surprise. You're able to like enter a surprise, not know what's going to happen, and coordinate your action around the surprise. You're able to not have an intent and stuff happen. Well, you know, in economics, there's a lot of people that warn that central planning doesn't work, that you get all sorts of unintentional consequences if you do that. You want to have something that's more organic. Why would it be any different than relationships, right? Like if you have an intention, there's always an intent, there's always a purpose. It feels totalitarian. Well, likewise, when you have central planning, you can have a totalitarian unintentional, right? So you need something organic. Like the moment the market has an intention, like it's been taken over by banks or something, and it's about GDP, that's another conversation. The moment the market feels like it has an intent, what happens? Lots of trouble. So likewise, in social relations, there's a way in which there's too much of an intent. It becomes like command economy. It becomes like command socialization, and the whole thing dies. But that means you have to be able to have relations without intention. Surprise coordination, right? That's scary. And that would require just ability and capacity and the ability to respond to the raw encounter and the surprise, right? And that, the only alternative to that is this sort of fixedness that ultimately AI, Nick Land, the logic of capital takes over. Because if you always have to have a point, then you're aligning yourself with a system that is preset, and then it's just gonna capture you, like Deleuze says. If you want your own line of flight, as Deleuze talks about, by definition, it's going to be some sort of surprise coordination, some sort of ability to not have an intention and to see what happens and to be able to vibe, right? And it not be lame. And I basically think when people say this they don't get the vibe. It's not connection. This is idle talk. They don't get the vibe. Like, what's the vibe? I don't get the vibe. I don't feel like I'm part of it. I don't feel like I can enter this without knowing your intentions. That's mostly what people are saying. It's like, so why are we talking about philosophy? They're kind of saying, I don't get your intention. And the philosophy person is like, I don't have an intention. That's how we create a vibe. And the person's like, well, if you don't have an intention, then why are you talking about it? Because I'm trying to create a vibe. And the person's like, how can you create a vibe if you don't have an intention to create a vibe? And there's this talking pastness that occurs that then leads to anger, possible anger because the social field is broke and then there's an explosion and hurt. But once you get, this is the paradox of needing surprise coordination. When surprise as a concept is what you are not habituated into socially. In fact, you are habituated into the opposite by the logic of the pragmatist, utilitarian, capital economic system. Like you are trained into the opposite way of thinking, and so you don't have the training to enter into a conversation to think in terms of surprise coordination. So you end up with this inability to kind of figure out what you need to make a vibe, unless you just happen to run into people who have a wound and thus get it. If you don't just happen to run into people who just get it, well then it's really hard to make it happen. And some of the people that don't get it, you live with, or they're your family, or you work with them. And so there's a certain frustration or anger that can emerge, and that's why anger and philosophy seem to have these kind of tied things that go together. More can be said, but let me give it to Mr. Tyler Murphy. Mr. Murphy, it is great to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well.
Doing great. See if I can vibe into this a little bit. I think growing up, I think I might have became an artist because I couldn't vibe in conversation very much. Like I have an older brother who we called him Babbler Brett. That was his nickname. So he did all the talking growing up. and I just go off and oh, this, your guys' conversation is dumb. I'm gonna go off and play with my toys or paint and it's so funny that still happens to this day. Like every Sunday I go and watch football with my dad and my brother and a few other family members, and they're all talking. They have the exact same conversation every single time. I could write it down and it would be the same every time. And that drives me, well, I guess it sometimes drives me nuts, but I'm liking this conversation because I think it's really helpful for that of what I'm struggling with, but also like going into the holidays. I mean, probably a lot of us are going to encounter this same thing. And it's like, okay, what is it about these repetitive, ritualistic, points of conversation? What is that helping to do? And also, yeah, I've been thinking about this tension that I have, say, with my brother, who always, his go-to question for me is, how much are you weighing in at these days, Ty? So talk about, something that doesn't cause belly laughing for me, but really gets really annoying to me. And I kind of freaked out on him the other day. And so then it's like, oh God, what was that about? Why? And it's like, okay, Brett, I'm just dying to have a conversation with you that goes beyond, I think the language I've been putting into it is like, that goes beyond mere appearances. Like, who cares about what I look like or which one of us weighs more than each other? Can we get, but for whatever reason, these same questions, same pieces of conversation, I think that it has something to do with, it covers over, then we don't have to necessarily confront anything that's really real. And so, yeah, I'm sitting here kind of thinking of the question, why is it so hard to enter into speculative conversation with friends, or not with friends? That's a good slip. With family members. Yeah, just also wondering, if gossip and idle chatter is some form of defense against confronting something real. And yeah, sometime there needs to be a net conversation to do, or maybe not necessarily a net conversation, but I really want to have a conversation around that dog whisperer episode after, and I bet that I think that there's a really good way of understanding psychotic, neurotic, and perverse, those structures in Lacan based on that episode. But anyways, yeah, I think I love too, Daniel, that you brought up just even the words surveillance talk, and that I think that'll be on my mind of going into the holidays, of how can we break, is it possible to break out of that kind of surveillance talk? I don't know if anybody has any thoughts or strategies on how do you get kind of beyond that. I'd love to hear it. That's all.
You are beautiful, and a net episode South Park special does sound perfect, where we go over all, I mean, if you really want good political commentary, I am hoping there's a drone episode. It's going to be great. So that's going to be grand. I think, predator cloaking also can help you avoid the surveillance talk. If you come in invisible like the predator, that works. That can go a long way. I think basically we have no idea what we're doing when we talk. Like, why do we talk? What's the point of it? Why are we trying to achieve? We actually don't know. Like, we don't know. We just know we're supposed to do it. We know it matters, but we have no idea what to do. And we've never had, to Luber's point, the pre-talk. Why do we talk? Because we're human, because we love each other, because we communicate. Couldn't you like love each other by just hugging one another? Why don't we just go in at the holidays and hug one another or nod? Why do we talk? Like, why do we talk? Because we're coordinating action, you could argue, right? And I'll give it to Mr. Kashir and Michael and then Philip. Like, oh, and before I forget, as a little note, when Habermas and everyone is talking about the necessity of commutative rationality, none of that is going to work unless we ask the question of what is the quality that one is looking for in communication. If commutative rationality is, say, who wins the debate quantitatively, who makes the most points, the problem with debates versus, say, dialogos is debates are quantitative usually, right? Like who wins, who made the best points, who gets the judges. Debate as quantitative will never work. Well, if it means then if we're looking for a quality, the question is, what is the quality, right? And basically, commutative rationality or dialogos as having political or business or economic ramifications will not work unless people sense the quality of the belly laugh, per se. Like if Democrats and Republicans got in the room and like, oh my gosh, we could have a good time here, then democracy may work. Right now, Democrats and Republicans get in the same work as like, I hate this person. Well, you're not going to have any commutative rationality until literally political discussions are defined by some sort of feeling of the possibility of the belly laugh or having a good time. Politics is doomed. Like, and I actually think what's interesting is that basically philosophy is that space where you actually have a sense that it's possible to have fun talking about things like economics and politics, and therefore it's more fruitful. And there's something about philosophy that adds the possibility of making things fun to talk about and belly laugh that usually suck to talk about. That seems to be another reason why you do it. It's like, wow, in philosophy, we can actually talk about vulnerability and difference and hard times and it'd be fun. Oh, I like this. And that means the reason you're doing philosophy is not because, you know, you think philosophy, human, all of that is the greatest ever. It's because it adds the possibility of a quality of the belly laugh to things that otherwise you never get a belly laugh in. And that, I think, is really important. It changes the qualitative whole. And yeah, you know, if ultimately so much of this is vibe, and human beings are kind of like fields, as we were speaking with Aspasi and Seth about, and like we are fundamentally a field. I think basically conversation is we're kind of like field hunters. Like we're kind of like looking for fields. We're looking for vibes, and we're looking to create fields. And language is a necessary component of field creation, which creates a certain quality of experience. Like we all have a kind of subconscious desire to find a field. And that's intimacy, and we're looking for, but intimacy is not merely the I say I love you, but a qualitative feeling of a shared field. And the issue is there is something about philosophy that seems uniquely possible to create a field in the relationship. And it seems uniquely possible to avoid, it seems like a skill that helps you avoid surveillance dialogue, that helps you avoid like making people like just not asking you, hey, what's your weight these days? Like philosophy says, you shouldn't start a conversation with that. Like, why does philosophy teach you that? Because it has a sense of that screws up the field. There's something about philosophy that is field hunting. It teaches you to sense quality. We call it philosophy, but like if philosophy is the love of wisdom, I do think wisdom is basically, I think it's basically the love of field. It's the love of vibe. It's the love of a certain field. Like the wisdom feels like something. Wisdom is not merely a mental exercise. Like you feel wisdom when you're around it. Like when you're around, that's the model thing Jockin was talking about. Why is that person a model? Because you felt wisdom around them, right? You felt a certain vibe. And I think what you're saying, like going to art because you couldn't vibe with the conversation. Yeah, I think that's a lot of it. And then you end up in philosophical conversation because it's not conversation as such you don't like. It's non-vibing conversation. You're vibe hunting. Like I went into fiction and photography and walking in the woods. I think basically everyone here can tell their story in terms of field hunting. Like everyone's biography is a biography of field hunting, basically. Whether you knew it or not, you are looking for a field. And I think basically when people talk about a meaning crisis, they're talking about a field crisis. They're talking about finding a certain field. And when you think about field or atmosphere or vibe, and you start saying, how do we restore democracy and have effective political, economic, well, you talk in language of fields, not merely quantity and quality. And there's just something, I think we're all field hunters ultimately, but let me give it to Jacob, Michael, Philip, and then Christian. Jacob Kashir, it is good to see you. I love the Christmas background. I love it. I hid the candy canes in that tree. I hid them so. Jacob Kashir, please.
Oh man, I hid some other things in that tree too.
Squirrels. There's all sorts of squirrels.
No, I love that. Let a brother preach on the fields. I was feeling that, man. It was coming through. It was like exactly what I was already thinking about. So that's a good indication of what we're in. I loved what Tyler was talking about too. I think that something about family is like there's so much is hidden in plain sight. It's like there's huge like Grand Canyon sized depths hidden behind the small talk that and I don't even have a judgment of people like why don't you want to go to the deep stuff. It's just that's just not even like the right way of approaching it, I think. But let me rewind it all the way back to earlier on. I feel like we're circling around some really important foundational stuff. I love the net. The net is a very unique entity. The net exists within a field, and part of the reason that the net works is because there is a field that's been generated by all of the previous nets that has, I would say, based on the work of Chris Bache, who I've just been reading, The Living Classroom, and its amazing work on principles of fields in education. The field of the net exists independent of the people participating in the net. So if we took out 90% of the people in the net and put new people in, they would still be coming into something of the field of the net. And the field of the net exists within the field of Eunoia and of probably philosophy writ large and of parts of the academy and also of the liminal web. So all of those fields are kind of like this, there's like a water basin type metaphor in there. You guys can figure it out. But I think, a lot of philosophy as we've been circling around as even this space, I'm so amazed. I love how this space is developing. I feel like some of the traps of academic philosophy are just dissolving in this space over the last couple of years. And I think a big part of that is the integrative aspect of this space. It's basically a boundary dissolving quality. And it's for that same reason that whenever I'm facilitating a space, I will always have checking in as a foundational piece, even if we're going to talk about something intellectual, philosophical, or abstract. In fact, especially if we are to have a check-in that is completely open prior to getting into the topic. And what will happen almost always is that the material that comes through in the check-ins will feed into. So we have check-ins and then we have a dialogue on the nature of fields, for example, then that stuff will have weird synchronistic connections and it will weave through and it will inform the content of that. So check-ins are a great way to do that. The net is another less defined model, but one that is increasingly inviting more of life to be included within it, which I think is the ultimate direction for philosophy, is to integrate more of reality into it. Yeah. And then just the midsection of the dialogue with respect to healing. There was something coming up for me around dialogue as a basis for healing, and maybe that there's a desire to get to the deep terrain or go through philosophy to get to some realness or some healing, but that's not actually the way to get there. And that's the safety that's required, or the connective ground that's required to be able to have that kind of conversation might need like several years of coming at it from a different angle of getting to the belly laughs, or, something more like physical playfulness or some other like completely other direction needs to be tapped in order for the other channel to open. And it also couldn't be instrumental of like, I'm going to connect with you with banter because I really want to have this other kind of thing. But yeah. And then the foreplay. Yeah. Got to have it. Yeah, actually, that's all, folks. But this has been a cracker of a conversation. I also want to note, man, I just feel like so impressed with the patience that this space is imbuing me into, because it's a very rare thing to like set the intention of speaking. It's almost like when you're at a live event and you get up to stand in the line, and you like would stand in the line with like 10 people in front of you, and you're just so like sweaty and nervous, like gonna go up and speak on the microphone, and you're thinking about what you're gonna say the whole time, but like with none of those negative qualities, just like totally present to the space. So really nice. And then I was thinking about the subjectivity of the, unborn baby inside of Michelle, that, I was just like, went off on a little tangent there. Like, how is baby experiencing this conversation, pre-language, just a bunch of like vibrations in the void, like communion of the womb. So yeah, that was a trip too, but I think that should be included in the net as well.
The baby experiences it as, so that's how the vibrations are experienced. And actually, you probably couldn't hear any of that because I've learned that Zoom cuts out high frequency squeals. So you probably just saw me making weird noises and you didn't. So the baby's having a great time. That's really funny. I'm really interested. I think your point you're making, I'll give it to Michael, Philip, and then Christian on this point of healing. I think this is really important. What are we trying to heal, right? Like, what are you trying to heal? You don't have a broken leg. You can go to work. You can eat. What exactly are we trying to heal? Because I think you're correct. I think people go into philosophy often trying to heal something, even if they can't put that into words, right? Like, there's a sense of that, right? I think it's the field. And I think fields are relationships. Relationships are field-like. They're not lines between people. They're a field. They're an activity. There's a kind of flow to them, right? And there's a feeling that life doesn't have the field. I want to heal the field. And honestly, I don't think humans feel healed unless their field is healed, right? There's something off about their experience. And what's weird is one of the reasons you end up in philosophy is because how do you heal a field? I don't even see it. I can't even quantify it. I can just feel it. And maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm crazy. So maybe I should just be healed because I'm crazy and I just think there's something wrong when there's not. Maybe I should just not be. Maybe I shouldn't be bothered when somebody asks me about my weight. Maybe I just shouldn't be bothered. Maybe I just shouldn't be bothered when people are talking about like getting upset about politics. Why am I bothered? Maybe I should be like Michelle. Maybe I'm just like not confrontational enough. Maybe there's something wrong with me. I definitely think one of the first ways that people try to heal themselves is by blaming themselves. If I'm not healed, it's my fault. I'm why I'm not healed. But what ends up happening is if you don't end up in philosophy, I think that's what happens. You just go down a long road of seeing yourself as the problem, and then you deconstruct and eat yourself forever, right? Philosophy is where you go, no, it's not that there's something wrong with you per se. If there is, it's the same wrongness that everyone has. There's a fundamental lack or whatever. But actually, you need to heal something that is not so obvious. As like, it's just easier to say I'm broken than the field is broken, actually. Because when you start saying the field needs to heal, or you say the relationship needs to heal, there's a way in which you have less power over that. But if it feels like you have more power to fix things if you're the problem. If I'm the problem and I'm broken, then I could fix that, which is, of course, ironic because if you're the broken thing, how do you have the capacity to break it? And eventually that road just leads you to the place where you give up, but at least you feel like you're giving up and ought to give up because there's no hope. Like, there's actually something comforting to getting to the place where there's no hope because then it's over. Okay, there was never any hope. We were always screwed. It's done now, right? There can almost be a sense of an ending in hopelessness. And that's a counterfeit ending, like we were saying earlier. Humans need a sense of the origin and the direction. Hopelessness gives you a sense of the future. It's like an ending. I found it. I have arrived. I reached it. I'm finished. I don't have to worry about it anymore. I'm the problem. And since I'm the problem, I can't fix it. The game is over. Great. It's done, right? And philosophy runs in and says, hey, that's damnation. That's damnation. Don't do that. And then you're like, well, philosophy, what else can I do? What else? Well, there's this thing called a field we're trying to heal. I don't see it. I know that. I know you don't see it, but you can sense it and you can get into better habits and you can learn it and you can actually engage with people to get a better sense of it. That's nonsense. Why not? Come on, let's give it a shot. And so that willingness to try to heal the field is, I think, what you're ultimately sensing. And I think that's ultimately what you're getting. And I do agree that very often when people say it's idle chatter or what's the point, what actually most people mean is, where's the healing? Like, there's a way in which a meaning crisis, I keep saying this in different ways, but when people talk about a meaning crisis, it's almost like a healing crisis. Like, I can't find healing. Like, where do I go to find healing? How do I get healing? What do I even need to heal? Right? Like, where am I going? Right? There's a sense of, I don't know how to heal things. And because I don't know how to heal things, it's all, what's the point? Like, what is the point? If we can't heal anything, then what's the point? Right? Like, what's the point? What ultimately can you accomplish if you can't heal? What is accomplishment if healing is not an option on the table, right? And so I think that's also part of the sense. More can be said, but let me pass it to Michael here. Michael, please.
Yeah, I really love where this conversation is going. And I know Michelle left, but congratulations on the pregnancy. That's such amazing news. And I think just how I was reacting to that, like in the moment, is a testament to this field of like, I've never met any of you in person. I feel like I'm still like pretty new to the net, comparatively speaking. And there was just this feeling of like just sheer joy and like just excitement for both of you. And like, so obviously there's something about this space that, even though we're mainly talking about ideas and, philosophy, that there is this personal dimension that it's interesting because I mean, in most of the healing conversations, profound healing conversations, I mean, I've been fortunate to, have an amazing therapist who, changed my life, literally changed the trajectory of my life and the career choice that I'm in. And I've been circling authentic relating type practices. And usually the healing conversations are like explicitly personal. It's like someone sharing deeply about their experience, their traumas, their difficulties, and like being held in that space. And often some of the most healing for me is listening to someone else, not necessarily divulging my own. But there's something about this space that we can externalize what we're talking about to something that transcends the personal, but it includes the personal. It doesn't abandon the personal. And I think that's something, when people feel kind of this disembodied nature to philosophy, this kind of stale, abstract, kind of difficult to grasp nature of philosophy, I think it's when the ideas being spoken are used as a mask for the personal, where the professor or whoever's speaking is kind of just regurgitating propositions instead of having a real felt sense that those ideas live in that person and they are acting them out in the world. And I think that's what makes this field so unique and special, is that like we're all on our own journeys of taking these ideas that have like really like affected us at a core level, and have shaken the very foundation from underneath us and like compelled us on a journey, and we speak from that place, like and I think that's also the novelty and the surprise, is that like through every word we are like discovering something new, and it's like it has a heartbeat to it. Like each word has a heartbeat to it, instead of it being like the feeling of like cooking, and it's like you're following, the same recipe that like your great grandmother passed down, and it's like it's like a rote task at this point. It's like you could do it in your sleep, versus like, oh shoot, like, all right, I'll just take some tomatoes and some broccoli and some bread, and I mean, I'm making the worst possible meal in my head right now, but like you're just taking random things and like putting them together. But there's like, there you make it work because you love food and you understand food science, and you understand like how flavors work. So it's like there's still like a foundational understanding of how this thing works, but there's like a improvisation. The dinner logos, yeah, exactly. And that's what makes these conversations so alive. And yeah, and the last thing I'll say is like, I really resonated with the idea that like all of us have are field hunting. Like I really resonate with that. I feel like for me that I had like a real profound crisis of meaning like very early on in my life, and like it set me down all of these different kind of paths. And I really resonate with like the pilgrim archetype, like the person who's like, kind of on always seemingly on the hunt for wisdom and meaning. And there's a curse to that, because there's kind of always a sense of you're never really home where you are. Like there's always a sense of like continuing to move. But when you do find something that really feels like home, you know it, because you know what it feels to not have it. And I definitely feel that here. And so, yeah, I'm just really grateful to be here.
No, delightful. And I'll pass it to Philip and Christian, and then if anyone has anything, please. It's I think definitely like most conversations are fetching. What did you do today? And I'm going to fetch the answer. What did you do at work? I'm fetching versus gifting, where gifting has a certain surprise. And there's something about gifting and healing that is tied. It is hard to feel healing where there is no gifting occurring. And good to see you, Mr. Jockin. And so I think, like, again, a lot of people talk about relationship and friendship, but the problem with like the meaning crisis is, I think, a field crisis. Like you're looking for certain field, which means you're looking for a certain experience of the possibility of the belly laugh. You're looking for the gift instead of a fetching. You're looking for this possibility of surprise and different things. And when people talk about relationships, the danger with that is it can overly emphasize a single person you have a relationship with, as opposed to a field that you bring with you no matter where you go. Right? Same can go with a community. If you overemphasize community as opposed to the field that community affords, then you can actually have a possessiveness, or you can never leave, or what if you lose them, right? Like if you put first things first, you get second things also. If you put second things first, you lose both, as Mr. Lewis puts it. And also too, if I have a meaningful relationship, well, then why have relationships with anyone else? And I can actually avoid the other with the other, right? And so there's a way in which, by emphasizing the field, which is quality versus quantity, that also is putting a certain, raising yourself up to a certain condition to meet those different fields, right? And so I think there's a shift in that emphasis there. There's more to say, but let me give it to Philip here. Philip, please.
Make the cake.
Christmas cake. Oh, he's cooking. He's cooking. He's done.
Was that high enough? Was that high enough?
I could actually make you out a little bit. I could make you out a little bit. Zoom allowed it.
I got to work on them upper registers. Hey, anytime anyone says anything about Merry Christmas, Happy Christmas, just hit them with the humbug. Go back, humbug. You know that Christmas Carol, man? That's a story about conversion, right? This dude, he can't decide whether or not, greed or love should win out. And then he gets visited. Oh, look at this guy.
Humbug.
Look at this guy with the
Humbug! I hate happiness. I hate it.
the question I think we're asking a lot of the times here is like, what is life affirming?
Yep.
You know? And it's like, do we live in a death affirming kind of field? And I think it was Charles Dickens that had that thing about the best of times and worst of times. Like, you get this deal where, like, what was it? Like, some Israeli drone hits a 16-year-old Palestinian who's in a wheelchair. You've got the school shootings, you know, fill in all the blanks, all the terrible things that are happening. But then also, like, the less reported heartwarming stuff is also going on. And I wonder how much of the way that the field is set comes from an ability to pay attention when negativity arises, right? So, like, I feel like this is what we're training ourselves on some level. It's like, oh, there's some negativity. Okay. Is that enough to kind of hit the red button and eject? Or is it like, no, I've kind of seen this before. And a lot of vibing comes from pattern recognition. And how many times in the net do you have to kind of keep moving forward with a nebulous pattern? You know, and this, you know, in and of itself, I think is something we're just not taught to value. And so we come here and we're transvaluating, because generally this is gonna turn the collective spell of advertisers into, like, you know, something everyone sees. Like, if they hit you with, like, hey, you're a piece of shit if, and then you just like, you know what, you're fucking right. Like, I guess I do need Colgate toothpaste, you know, like, duh, that's why I'm not getting the girls. And how to kind of like go with what is outside of the parameters of whatever's called the norm without getting locked up, without getting put on too many meds. And so much, I mean, so much of that food conversation is like the way we feed ourselves can be life affirming, or like kind of a slow suicide, you know what I'm saying? And like the same goes with our algorithmic diet. So you get into a place where you're like blown into smithereens because you're with someone. Because I think one of the auras, you know, they talk a lot about like the Snow White complex. Like this is like something for like a woman to like be like, oh, I'm glowing up. You know, like I got a good aura because everywhere I go, you know, like the squirrels follow me and the flowers bloom and all this. And I joke with my boys sometimes, like, that for guys is when you're at a place and like homeless people or schizophrenics come up to you and like are like, yo, what up? Like, what's happening? You know, like you're not too buttoned up for them to be, you know, like automatically you're not on the same vibe. But it's kind of interesting because what they're doing is vibing in a way that, you know, I might actually take a little bit of issue with what Jockin said about like your social acuity being a certain way. I think the most important thing there is the whatever you want to call it, structure of the big other of the society that you're in. Like, if it's super insane and you're like, hey, I'm kind of having a tough time like fitting in with all these people that say like, yeah, this past weekend I performed a bunch of violence to like the younger and the weaker, and you're like, so this is where you get back to the ethics. And like, of course we're all almost always in a social setting putting on mask after mask after mask after mask, and some people are a little better at that than others. But I wonder like how much we can set up different fields to allow people to start, you know, with like Taylor Swift did this and be like, oh, cool. Like, yes, affirm that. Be with that. Understand that like what's going on there. Like maybe we're all talking about God all the time. from a different perspective on the field. Like if someone's like, I like Fruit Loops, and someone else is like, no, bro, you got to eat avocado or whatever. And, you know, and they're both like, this is where it is. This is where it is. And it's like, is there actually any place on this planet where it's not? And I think sometimes then I get to this place where I do follow the psychotic discourse, and I'm like, what can you just make yourself belly laugh for like your entire life? Like, is this something similar to the communion Saint Therese found, that ecstasy, is that she had this like ability when she was quote unquote with herself, but maybe she was in communion with God, to get to a vibrational frequency that is so life affirming that it's just like this, yes, yes, amen, 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 and then like to the point that anyone looking at her would be like, are you completely out of your mind? And like from her perspective, she's like, how are you not feeling this? Because when you're in that, I feel like then you become this magician, you become this alchemist that can go into any field, your family field, and you can play that life affirmer. You can take everything that everyone's giving you and be like, yep, and take it and just spin it into gold, Rumpelstiltskin style. So yeah, that's what I got.
No, I think that's a magnificent what has been individually confirmed as possible by the mystic is now to some degree necessary to spread in order to deal with the problems of global pluralism. Because we do know that state is individually and quote unquote psychotically possible. Now the question is there an infrastructure or social condition that increases the probability that there is a critical mass of individuals that have some degree of that capacity and interaction of the belly laugh or the field that could then mitigate some of the more very problematic tensions of global pluralism that make it impossible to have any sort of harmony between difference? Because what you are describing too, the capacity of the mystic to integrate with whatever the environment they are in means they can deal with difference as itself without turning it into a mirror of themselves, right? So there is something politically consequential about that ability that for most of history we've said, well, it's just rare and individual and only can be there for mystics, right? And yeah, there does seem to be something about that, but that capacity is basically the only way to deal with a global pluralism that does not devolve into either psychotic discourses like the conspiracy or individual kind of fragments that are going off, or return to a new totalitarianism that is simply totalizing everything into a singular discourse, right? And so, you know, if one says, well, this is impossible, well, I think people end up in philosophy because they have a sense that the impossible must be tried. And maybe the impossible, we can only know what's impossible unless we're God. And so if we're not God, we don't know that it's impossible. And so we're groping. There's a certain sort of groping around, because also that there is something about that. And then I'll give it to Christian here and then Tyler. There is something about that is what the mystic does. The mystic is trying to get unity with God, knowing you can never get full unity with God unless you're God, right? There's a certain impossibility that the mystic is living their life to do, knowing they can't, and yet not all failures are equal, right? I think there is something about philosophy that's like that. That there is a certain, we know it is impossible to always have healing in all circumstances, to be able to improv any disaster, any mistake. We know it's impossible to, in every situation, be able to bring out a proper field, and yet the effort to try to realize that is actually better than not, even if it's an ultimate failure, right? There is some sort of making possible the impossible that the mystic is doing, that I think philosophy is also doing, just not in so obviously of a mystical way, because there is always something mystical about fields. Like the moment you talk about fields, you're talking about something that's on the same gradient as the mystical, even if it's not of that intensity, right? You're talking about an aura, a shine. Saints are always what? Glowing. There's this language of a giving offness. Love feels like a giving offness. Spirit feels like a giving offness. Giving offness is also, I think, what basically everyone is looking for all the time. Like when people talk about, like, that is what everyone is looking for all the time. Because when people talk about love, I think that's what they're talking about. Love is not merely somebody says they like me. in a marital contract, love is literally that feeling of giving offness when I'm in that person's presence that I give off to them, and it creates some sort of field. So if everyone is motivated by love somehow, if we grant that, or they're motivated by the good, or they're motivated by the true or the beautiful, all of these are fields. The true is a field. Truth is not like, if you care about the truth, it's a field. It's not a fact. You don't care about facts. You only care about facts that somehow apply to your life, right? So it has to enter into a narrative, right? Like pure autonomous facts do not exist, and you notice them. Likewise, so everything that organizes human action seems to be the coordination of a certain field that, if you succeed in, creates a certain feeling. And maybe in that sense, you're always coordinating a relationship with God, right? Like it's always a certain coordination with God. And the more you coordinate with God in this sense, the more you access the field, the more you get healing. And is that not what the mystic is doing, right? And is there not a long history of mysticism and vision and healing and relationship and love, all these things to go together? It seems as if philosophy, when it's at its best, is on the same gradient. More to be said, but let me give it to Christian if you'd like to speak, and then Tyler. Christian, please, it's good to see you, sir.
Likewise, I just realized I was already unmuted, and I'm sorry if you had to hear me clacking away on my keyboard or something.
You are incredibly meditative in your unmuted state. Nobody heard anything. Your deep mystical contemplation is profound, Christian.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. And I was actually violently suppressing my belly laughs, very toxic behavior, the worst kind of silence. I have a joke. Why did the cowboy adopt a dachshund? Because he wanted to get along, little doggy. Yes, it's a good joke. It's my favorite joke. I think about laughter and humor so much. Actually, I'm still working on my little book of Christian's personal philosophy, and right now, at least, my three core virtues of human behavior, so to speak, or constitution, are humor and courage and skillfulness. But I have to qualify humor there, that obviously extending it beyond the sense of like comedic sensibility or something like that. But you know what you were talking about earlier, y'all, it helped me frame it a bit better in my mind. I think I'm gonna walk away very happy with having this thought. Yeah, I mean, it's something I've thought about a lot, but I just think the words are a little more precise now, because you brought up this word of surprise, Daniel, which I've heard you bring up many times before. But basically, I think humor could be said to be our ability to integrate surprise. It's yeah, and that encapsulates a lot of things, though. It's about grace. It's about kind of, what do I want to say, energetic stabilization. You know, a question I've asked myself a lot is, why do we laugh when somebody slips on a banana peel? Like, you know, it's across the street, someone slips on a banana peel, they legitimately hurt themselves, and we go, like, we don't go, oh my God, are you okay? No, we crack up. And why is that? And my thought there is that there's two things. One, there's a surprise, right? We are caught off guard by reality for a moment. People aren't supposed to just randomly fall when they're walking down the sidewalk, and all of a sudden they did anyways. But why we have like maybe a more comedic, humorful reaction than more of like a sanguine, or however you say that word, sanguine, something like that. I've never said it out loud, I realize. Anyway, I think it's because there's a friction, basically, that the surprise causes. We have the surprise, we have the impetus, the motivation to want to eliminate that surprise. It's not a good surprise. We don't want to have people randomly falling on the sidewalk all the time. And so, but then there's this recognition of like, wait, well, there's nothing I can do about a fucking banana peel. What are we going to do? Create a law and have the banana peel police going around searching for banana peels? Like, are we going to, you know, have like banana Karens going around, make sure people don't discard their banana peels on the side? No, there's like practically nothing you can do about the fact that sometimes someone will slip on a banana peel. Um, and so then you have this excess of energy within you that has nowhere to go. You're not going to try to fix the banana peel problem. You're not going to go give a person a hug because they don't really need a hug anyways. They're fine. They just fell on their butt. So what do you do with that excess energy? You fucking laugh. It's like you're a gong, and because you are not changing your behavior, because you're not being like so to speak like responsive to the situation, you're kind of remaining stiff in some sense. Like, I can't do anything about that. And so the energy that strikes you is now like kind of resonating you and making you vibrate. Ha 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 ha, he. And you're getting that energy out in the wisest way. You know, well, at least it could be the wisest way, which is to just laugh and smile, to regulate your own energy and your emotions, and get back to baseline and continue about your day and la di da di da. So, you know, so when we think about can is this a conversation? Is this an interaction? Is this a mindset that I have where I can belly laugh? I think that has a lot to do with our ability to handle surprise and to regulate our energetic and emotional and cognitive responses to surprise. And it can, I think so. For instance, like if someone were to say something that's like a little bit of a dig at you, and there's some actual truth, some like real pointiness to it. If you know, at least in certain circumstances, your ability to laugh at yourself in a like wholehearted, whole-bellied way, I think is your ability to deal with the surprise of seeing parts of yourself that you didn't know were there. Like, oh shit, damn, you're right. I guess I do that. Or I kind of knew I did that, but I've just been not acknowledging it. And it's, you know, it's come up to the surface. And you know, maybe I'm not going to just fall down on my knees and start crying, because that wouldn't be appropriate with the specific instance of like a surprising surfacing of one of my own foibles here. So I'm gonna laugh. I'm gonna laugh at myself. Like, gosh darn it. And you know, that's not the end of the story. That's not the full healing that might be appropriate for encountering a surprise. There might be, after the laughter, some, you know, some self reflection, some contemplation, maybe an apology, something like this. But just that ability to have a belly laugh at yourself, I think, is indicative of I don't know, let's call it personal strength or virtuousness or something like that. And when someone can't laugh at themselves, I just take it as a kind of a bad sign, basically. And that's all I got.
That's magnificent. I'll throw it to Tyler before you. Tyler, you're gonna say Kierkegaard. You're beautiful.
Yeah, I could throw it in real quick. I just wanted, based on what Philip was saying about you know, talking about the saint, and I just wanted to maybe later when I come back and listen to this, if you guys have any thoughts on, you know, Kierkegaard and the Night of Faith. And there's that part in Fear and Trembling, I think, where he talks about how he can go along and whatever sort of situation he's confronted with, he just is able to kind of vibe with it. He is walking along and he's telling a stranger about how when he gets home, his wife is going to have this incredible meal all laid out for him. And then he gets home and finds that it's not there, but it doesn't even matter. He's like right on to the next thing. Yeah. And I wonder, you know, because Philip, I love what you were talking about of being able to be like Rumpelstiltskin and turn whatever you're kind of given into gold in some way. And I definitely, you know, I want to be that way. And at times I feel that sometimes I'm more that way than others. And I wonder if it has something to do with being sort of locked in on what I really feel like is my true drive or purpose or something in the world. And then it's like, whatever you get, if I'm centered on that, whatever the world has to throw at me, that I don't care. Whatever. Do you guys want to talk about the same old routine shit every week? Great. Like, or you want to call me fat or whatever? Like, what? I don't care. Anyways, I just wanted to throw that in, but I unfortunately do have to go. Okay.
Dude, I
Thanks.
think it's so much about, there's like this 7-layer dip I've been thinking about a lot, and like a lot of it is like how well do you vibe with silence? So like on the top, you've got like philosophies, underneath that there's thoughts, then there's words, then there's letters, then there's sounds, then there's feelings, and then there's silence. And like I think so often what we do is we get locked into being for or against, right? X, Y, Z. And there's no doubt that that's like kind of fun. As far as this is where I think Lacan is actually really, really good. And you can even take like McGowan's work in Capitalism and Desire and be like, happiness and enjoyment are antithetical. And the example he gives is like that like Star Trek episode where everyone's in the utopia and everyone's like happy and like no one's really talking and everyone's just vibing. But inside every single one of the people, there's like those desire eating bacteria or whatever. Because it's like, we actually don't have to talk. This is revolutionary, like maybe for some people to hear in the day and age we're in, but it's sort of like as soon as someone else starts talking, it's kind of like we have to talk. It's like that. It's like that bell of choice, it's that forced choice that if everyone were just quiet and minded their own business, and then it's like, okay, well, that's maybe happiness, but there's no enjoyment. Okay, maybe the enjoyment could come from just philosophical banter and people not getting personal with stuff. And they're like, every single time humans have tried that, we've gone to war. Every time so far, you get to this point where after someone says something, is like, oh, you thumb your nose at me, sir? And it's like, now we must fight. And then someone's like, oh, you did something to my cousin, and you did something to my nephew, and it's like, I think that on some level, I think we have some people who talk to war and some people who try to talk to peace. And in some like weird way, like even trying to talk to peace, like start some kind of war if you're not smart about like the anti-movements that are coming out of like what you're trying to like bring peace, to. And I think so much of it has to do with like the inability to keep our tongue still. It's like it's like you could just not. We could all just not. But I think so much of that is just goes against almost all of our conditioning. So like one of the questions is like, is it possible to cease being all that you've been? And this is where you get into, I forget the dude's name who was talking with Cadell, but like the difference between emptiness and the void, where he's like, emptiness is like a lack, whereas the void is like full potential. And I think a lot of things like people get upset about with people going deep, like hard in the paint in philosophy, is they recognize like, oh, I have the potential to be like that person, but I spend all my time on TikTok. And there's like a part of them, instead of being like, hey, could you like teach me how to get into these books, or like get into like having conversations like this, because all my friends talk about are like getting high and eating Pop-Tarts. And there's not like there's anything wrong with getting high and eating Pop-Tarts, like that's, you have a Jolly Rancher, whatever gets you going. But I think like that is, one of those things that's like getting in our way, that people don't know how to stop that train, so that if the direction is slightly off, and I feel like what philosophy sometimes is trying to do is like take this yacht that has no rudder, but it's going like super fast, and is like, okay, I can build a rudder on this thing and we can point it in the right direction, even though we have no idea where we are. And we can't even agree on where we've come from. So it brings up these interesting, like, yeah, like you say, like improvisational opportunities that I think some people would rather die than try.
No, I think that's magnificent. I think a lot of philosophy arises from the realization you will be spoken to. Someone is going to speak to you. Or you leave society and then you ask, why should I leave society? Or why is it ethical to not face the speech act versus run from it, right? Because speech is interesting, because in the moment of speech, I always like, and I'll give it to Michael here, and then if anyone has any final things. And I love what you said, Christian, humor, courage, skillfulness. There's a lot there. Laughter as integration, I think, is very powerful. Speech is interesting because it is something that feels deterministic and yet isn't. Like when I say to you, I hate you, you are now forced to experience that, right? It like you have no choice. And at any moment, I may say something, you don't know what I'm going to say, right? And you will then have to respond to it, because even if you choose not to respond to it, that still has relational impact, right? So you are always caught in a kind of deterministic situation that, funny enough, if it was actual determinism, wouldn't bother you. The reason why it bothers you is because it's deterministic of a freedom. It's determining something that feels free. Because when I say to you, do you want to go to the movies and you don't want to go, an example I make all the time, you feel something's been taken from you. What you feel is your freedom's been taken from you. You feel as if the field, as you had it arranged, that was stable and maybe equilibrium, is now a threat of being wounded, and then you would have to do the work of healing it, right? So then you feel obligated to go to the movie even if you don't, right? And so there's a weird way in which the speech act is the kind of ground zero of the war between freedom and determinism. It's like the ground zero, and philosophy kind of emerges, and for Hegel, it's always about freedom. Philosophy, I think, is inseparable from the speech act and the facing of the speech act and what you're going to do about the speech act. And also you come into philosophy because you're like, well, if I'm around human beings, there's like a 99.99999% chance they're going to speak to me. And so I better be ready for that. And if they don't speak to me, they might be mad at me, or they're a mystic, and then they're not even going to be in the society or something, right? Or if they are, then the question is, well, how did they figure out how to be a mystic in the midst of the society? Shouldn't I figure out how to do that as well? So the speech act demands of you a question of how you respond that almost always takes you to philosophy, because you have to learn how to speak or how to interact with speaking, and you can't learn the laws of speech like you can the laws of billiard balls or rocks. You can't find, like, there are no natural laws of speaking. There are kind of structures of speaking, or maybe, Chomsky tried to find some sort of like universal grammar or whatever. But even if that exists, that doesn't give you the laws of the relationship of speaking or the encounter and surprise of speaking. Speaking is always improvisational, even if there's some physical or biological explanation of that. And philosophy is almost like crap, there's going to be language. What do we do? And if we do it badly, there will be consequences. I don't think it's by chance that many philosophers also write and do fiction and literature and art. Even painting is a kind of language, ain't it? Like there's some sort of, so many philosophers now are philosophers of language, right? And I think that's getting at it, but the problem is many of the philosophers of language are kind of the structure of language, or maybe trying to say philosophy is just language, like a Wittgenstein. There's almost a kind of existential language philosophy. The experience of speaking itself which opens up an entire horizon of psychoanalysis, metaphysics, and ontology, actually. Like, yes, language is kind of ground zero for philosophy, but the problem is we're overly atomizing the language itself, not the existential situation of language of which demands a response. And the very fact it demands a response means we have to think about the response. And the reason we care is because it generates the field. Language and field creation are indivisible, right? And if you're able to have silence and maintain the field, well, you've probably gone through language to get there, right? Like, how many people are born with mystical silence? Seemingly none. So if you get to mystical silence that maintains the field, you've gone through language. But basically, through history, the people who have done that have done stuff more in isolation or in the monastery. Our challenge today, you could say, is mystical silence or the mystical field in the presence of otherness, difference, politics, economics, and so on and so forth. And if we say that's impossible, then my claim would say we're saying basically global pluralism is impossible without devolving into something very problematic. There are things to say on the Night of Faith and also on what Christian was saying, but let me give it to Michael, and then if anyone has final things. Michael, please.
Yeah, I really am glad that Christian brought in humor, because I've been thinking about humor quite a lot for like almost a year. Because I feel like I'm going through this transition where like my humor is maturing, and I identified at a certain point that I somehow like made this association in my head that like humor and like laughing about things is like immature, and that's like for kids, and like, oh, the real adults like gotta be serious and like they can't laugh at things. Um and I was like, and then I was just like noticing in the world that like people who I thought were really wise, that were like exemplars for me, were also like the funniest people. And so I was like, well, fuck, like my my whole map is completely wrong. And so I'm like trying to like claim for myself, like what is humor as a virtue that isn't like, problematic. And what I've kind of got to is, well, I was doing a lot of like okay, well, like what is humor not? Like what are like bad examples of humor? And I think, the easiest ones to identify are the ones that like put down other people, like make fun of other people that are clearly just like coming from this like insecure place. Um, but I have arrived at something similar to what you're circling around, which is like humor is in the surprise. And so how I've found my way into like, a feeling of humor that feels authentic is like I just try and tell the truth to the best of my ability and just wait for something funny to come out of my mouth. Like, and sometimes it takes like, a really long time, or sometimes it's not necessarily something that's funny, but it's like I feel light within myself, and I feel like the belly laugh is accessible. And so I might not like, have like regale someone in this like, humorous story, or like have this, really hilarious thing that happened to me, but like by just being open to what unfolds, I'm porous to the laughter. Whereas like if I'm like, I remember I used to like be so socially anxious that before a party I would mentally think about like the coolest and the funniest stories that I have, and like it's almost like this like, I don't know, like manifesto in my head that I'm like and it's just like it sucked. Like just the conversation just sucked because of that. And yeah, and one last thing on humor is like, I was watching Return to the Jedi last night, and like the Battle of Endor, I just couldn't stop laughing because it's just the most ridiculous thing. Like a bunch of like these tiny little creatures are going against like a whole fucking fleet of stormtroopers, and they're like hurling rocks at these, massive walkers, and like taking, I don't know, bits of twine and like pulling on the big walker's legs and like tripping them over. And I think there's something hilarious in like a David and Goliath story. And I think what is inherently funny about people who make fun of themselves is their in to a certain degree, before it gets unhealthily self-deprecating, is like they're kind of positioning themselves as like a David, and like everyone else kind of like feels good about themselves, I think, when someone makes fun of themselves in that way. And like um I think that's why people love like people who have taken like a non-linear path in life, because there's more failure, and like failure isn't failure that like leads to, I think, courage and skillfulness, to what Christian pointed out, is like funny. I think failure that's just failure after failure after failure after failure like becomes kind of pitiful, but like failure that leads to virtue, um I think I find that really funny, because it's like it's relatable, but it's also aspirational in a way, and courageous. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, that's magnificent. And I've really enjoyed this discussion. So thank you all. And I now have this image of like they're doing bioengineering, and they're like, we have the ultimate super soldier, and out walks an Ewok. I think that's going to be great. It's like, you thought it was the Terminator. No, it's a teddy bear, and we're gonna storm the beaches with our teddy bears. So it's going to be great. We're going to defeat the alien invasion, or we'll take down the drones. That's what we need. We will deal with the drones in New Jersey if we have Ewoks. That's why we're screwed. We don't have Ewoks. What's that, Christian?
We don't have Ewoks. We need to take down the drones, because otherwise the drones are going to screw us. I'm trying to practice nonviolent communication here, and we're like mirroring back what you said. No, I put a link in there, and my email address is in this document. You already have my email address, Daniel, but for anyone else, the 4 horsemen here of us, I am soliciting feedback on my latest writing. So there it is.
Well, thank you, Christian. Human courage and skill is very useful. I look forward to reviewing that, and it's how we'll defeat the drones and the fake blue beam alien invasion. And this video was just taken off YouTube. But that's lovely.
And C3PO will be our deity. Remember, like they think C3PO is a god.
Yeah, instead of like worshiping the nuclear bomb like they did in that Planet of the Apes, we'll just worship CPO, so it'll all work out. It'll be great.
It's like a Tower of Babel situation, because he's fluent in like 6 million languages. I don't know.
So you saying Star Wars is like heresy? It's like secretly saying the Babylonians got it right, or the Babylonians got it right? Oh my gosh. George Lucas was always ahead of us. Frick. I love everything you were saying. Humor, integration. There is something in the effort of trying to tell the truth. Isn't it funny how that can lead to opportunities for human? But that makes sense, because trying to tell the truth is an act of integration. You are trying to integrate things together to fit in a manner that is true. And it's kind of funny, because that's impossible to ever complete unless you're God. And yet there's also something, like there is something heroic in doing so. You have to be doing something that's kind of funny to be heroic. Comedy, these things kind of go together, because there's something absurd, but the very absurdism then demands a certain character or courage that's noble, and it creates opportunities of humor in that absurdity, because there's the opportunity of the victory of actually doing it in a manner that helps heal the field, right? So there's an interesting blending of humor. Like, it's hard to root for a hero that's never funny. Like every Marvel movie required so much comedy in it when it was good, right? Why? Because like a hero that's not funny really is just cardboard. And if you really understood how difficult of the undertaking it is that you're taking on, you'd have to laugh in order to keep going, right? If you could find no funniness in it, you would probably stop. There is something about humor that is a necessary medicine to keep going. And the effort to find truth is like, if you're really going to keep going, you got to find some fun in it. Otherwise, after you read the 900th book and you feel like you've not made any progress, you'll be sad, like depressed, right? So there's something about humor that keeps you going and doing the impossible that if you don't do, there's some quality of healing the field that becomes impossible. Benjamin Fontaine was all about doing the Levi-Straussian impossible. He was basically like, humanity is doomed when we give up on the impossible. And basically the three infinites, or the idea of spreading conditions of mysticism or the mystical, all of these are impossibilities that we've seen people do. Well, that's what's interesting. We've seen humans do the impossible, and we know they failed, but we also know they did the impossible in the failure. That's the weird thing, and that's kind of funny because it's hard to describe. It's kind of funny that they tried to do the impossible and they actually did it. Oh, that's worth a good laugh. It's also funny that they would even try, and they had to have found it funny and fun to have done it. So there's something about humor that runs down the entire stack in the same way that, you know, Jacob was kind of like, there's, you know, Jockin and Jacob, there's got to be connection all the way down, right? Like, you can't enter a discourse if there's not connection all the way down. There's something about humor that has to be all the way down, or we're in big trouble. And a lot of the mystics, like Aquinas, Thomas, Christian, like, you know, I'm obsessed with it. We talk about it with Beauty, the three infinites. But there's a way in which humor has to run down the entire system, or else you would never do the impossible, without which we can't heal the field. Because, you know, in being in, like, having, like, going into a place without an intention, like being in the place of surprise, all of these is a kind of like, well, how do you do that? That seems impossible. Because it's fun. Oh, there's something about fun that kind of elucidates, it kind of lubricates your willingness to do these impossibilities, right? And it's also interesting that classically humor and humor were tied to medicines, right? You had the four humors. There's this idea that the body works by the humors. Obviously, this is an associational connection, but it is very, very interesting that humor, medicine, healing, all of these things kind of go together. And there's some sort of approaching the impossible that has some sort of healing structure. And I basically think humans are perpetually looking for healing. And in the way that we have described it. And there is something about approaching God, the transcendentals, that's another term for it, absolutely, Christian, is that there's something about the field or language, we're always coordinating or trying to heal the field. And there's something about approaching God in the mystical that is healing. The only way to heal the human condition, well, you know, if you say humans are fallen, then what are you saying? You're saying there's some sort of healing needed. There's some sort of medicine needed. There's some sort of address. I think also I'm really taken by the idea, well, let me note, when Kierkegaard talks about the Knight of Fate, there's a way in which it's kind of a flipping of Don Quixote. Because for Don Quixote, he's kind of absurd and he ignores the world, where the Knight of Faith has the faith that is able to take any absurdity and not lose themselves in it, but spin it. I think what Tyler said is very good. Don Quixote kind of melts his brain on reading about knights, and he finds in the psychotic discourse a way to function and carry on until he gets to the end and he returns to Alfonso the Good and dies. So there's a kind of problem where the Knight of Faith, because their absurdism is based on faith, they're able to flip whatever is thrown at them and they never turn back into Alfonso the Good. The weakness of the psychotic discourse is the possibility of one day hitting the limit and returning to Alfonso the Good and actually losing the Don Quixote. Whereas the Knight of Faith, because it's based on a transcendental, you never have to worry about turning back into Alfonso the Good, actually. You've found a way to carry yourself after the loss of your ideals and keep going, but it requires this ability to keep flipping, making a world, and have faith. Well, you're having faith that even if the dinner wasn't there like it was prepared for, even if life throws something at you that's unexpected, that there is the possibility of the transcendent in it, and there's the possibility of the integration with it. The Knight of Faith has a kind of faith that anything can be integrated. All things can be new. Anything can be brought in new creation based on if you, well, approach it in the right way. I'm really taken by the idea of laughter with the integration of excessive energy. There is something about a field that is energy, right? When you're in a good relationship and you're having a good time, you feel energy, right? And so the laughter, if you go into a relationship and there's no possibility of laughter, it's like there's no energy there. You don't feel energy. The possibility of laughter is a feeling that this is an energy generating space, right? That when I'm with these people, we all get energized and we get excited. And so, like, the quality of the surprise you know is possible in the conversation is tied to oh, I know these conversations generate energy. The people you don't want to come over tend to be what? Draining. The ones you're like, you're going to be here how long? Oh, no. Like, you know, because you have a feeling of it being draining, right? But even introverts, when you get, like, the right quality of surprise, is actually like, yes, they're going to be here and it's going to be energizing. And yeah, you might run, there might be some tiring dimensions, but it's not the relationship itself that's tiring. It's the fact that you have a body, have to eat, have to figure out work, and all of these other things, right? So there's an interesting energy dimension that is found in your favorite relationships that also tend to heal the field, because the presence of fields are the presence of energy, right? And so when you have a lot of energy, it tends to come out in laughter and excess, because there's an excess of energy that's looking to go. In a good conversation, there's so much energy going on. There's excess here, excess there, excess here. Whereas, like you're saying, when something unexpected, because a conversation is a structure of a gift, not fetching. So there's surprises, right? Just like the guy hitting the banana peel, excess of energy, something surprising, doesn't know where to go, laughter, right? Because you also know, like, that was unexpected. Well, the unexpected creates energy. The unexpected is negentropic more than entropic, right? So a good conversation that entails surprise has a negentropic structure. Also, negentropy, following a Rudd and complexity theory, tends to be complexity. Complexity tends to generate negentropy. I think this is a reason why it's philosophical discussion that often ends up energetic, or like these, when you're thinking through things with a group, because you're creating complexity that temporarily, it creates a negentropic effect by actually using up energy quicker. That's the irony of negentropy. It's using up entropy in a more efficient way, as Rudd and different people will talk about. So we're actually in this discussion using our energy more quickly, but we're also creating more energy more quickly as we use it up. So you get this very interesting feedback loop, but after the conversation, you're probably going to need to eat. You're probably going to be like, or there can be this kind of like energy that you feel was there, right? And so there's this interesting complexity. Conversations can have a way of generating energy, which that's what we kind of see. And that also is the feeling of the field, right? So it definitely seems to be the case that when there's the possibility of laughter, that's also like the belly laugh, as we've been talking about. That is also the indication that this is an energy creating space. And energy also heals, right? Like when you get more energy, your body feels like it, like that just applies to biology. Like the more energy you have, the more your body can natural healing and can engage in biology better. So likewise, if you can get energy from a relationship, that also has this field healing effect possibly. That is going on. But then in order to do the humor integration, it requires courage to enter into that vulnerability space, to the courage of the gift versus the fetching. And then you have to have the skillfulness to give the gift, to participate in the field, which in of itself requires risk and courage. So I really appreciate what Christian was saying there. I'm also taking as well, laughter, integration, excess, to tell the truth, best way, yes, fetch, gift. The other thing I was just going to say, Philip, when you said and then I'll have to go, alas, the idea of a nebulous pattern, I think that's getting at a lot. I think basically people who end up in philosophy have a sense that there's a nebulous pattern that if you lose track of, the field is at risk. Like there's a pattern of interaction that if you can't follow and vibe with, then there's a big danger there, actually. But the pattern is not obvious, and people don't even know they're creating the pattern, right? So it is nebulous. So you have to keep your eye on a ball that's invisible, that if you lose, the game is in trouble, right? The field is in trouble, right? So there's a nebulous pattern, and the nebulous pattern is of itself the model that you want to be more like. You want to get better at those nebulous patterns that are good versus self-effacing, right? So you're trying to keep your eye on that. And there's something about where the nebulous pattern itself requires so much energy to maintain. It becomes very liberating when you're with people who create a field, because then you feel like, the energy is more naturally there to maintain the nebulous pattern. Whereas if you're with people who don't help create energy, by helping create the field, you feel like you have to keep your eye on a nebulous pattern, and you're doing all the work to do that. No one else there is supporting you. And so that becomes like really like dire. Whereas you're with other philosophy people, we're all trying to maintain the nebulous pattern. So it feels more shared, it feels more communal, and it feels actually more graceful because we're all doing it together and we're all kind of supporting one another in that. And I think that nebulous pattern as well, look, if there's that idea of Zizek or Jesus, that the Holy Spirit is wherever two or more are gathered, and we've talked about what if all of this is always just basically perspectives on God, Well, every relationship has the presence of the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is glimpsed in those nebulous patterns. And we're always basically, through every language act, through every conversation, trying to condition ourselves to better have a perspective on the Holy Spirit that is always there at all times, right? That's kind of what the mystics are teaching. And in a sense, perhaps every conversation is on the same gradient as that, right? Because the mystic, and the reason I also say that is because if there's something about language that is a constant experience of freedom and determinism, like finitude, is not mysticism just a perpetual wrestling of the we have to relate to something that we can never in our finitude fully grasp, therefore determinism, and yet in that determinism we can freely condition ourselves differently based on what virtues or signs we try to coordinate, right? That's kind of what you are doing in language. You're constantly being confronted by something outside of your control, something you didn't choose, and yet you still have to respond to it. And the way you respond to it has giant effects on the field, the aura you give off, how you carry yourself, and the relations you have with the world as a whole, right? That is in a very real sense what the mystic is doing too, right? They are freely interacting with a determination that feels like they're not free because they can't overcome that determination, but then they accept that limitation as necessary for the mystical possibility, and they are glad in it, and they laugh. They integrate, they find it humorous, medicine, they integrate with that finitude and thus actually create a different field. And I think basically the language act is a similar isomorphic structure to what you are seeing very often, what you see in mysticism. It's just that we don't realize that. And thus, the language act turns into fetching versus gift. It turns into information versus field. It turns into checkup and surveillance as opposed to liberation, because we don't know what we're doing when we're speaking. We don't realize we're trying to be mystics. And as a result, we're not. I've enjoyed this immensely. Thank you all. It's been a pleasure. And Merry Christmas. I'm going to go look for candy canes. All the best. All the best. I'm going to listen to that Christian.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you.
And a Happy
all,
New Year.
And a happy